What if everything you know about one of humanity's greatest achievements is wrong? What if the most watched event in television history never actually happened the way we remember it? Picture this. It's July 20th, 1969. 500 million people around the world are glued to their television sets, watching grainy, black and white footage of a man in a bulky white suit taking his first steps on another world. Neil Armstrong's voice crackles through the static, proclaiming his small step for man, his giant leap for mankind. The world holds its breath. History is being made, or is it? For more than 50 years, a question has haunted the corridors of history, whispered in conspiracy theory forums, debated in documentaries, and argued over dinner tables across the globe. Did American astronauts really walk on the moon? Or was it the most elaborate hoax ever perpetrated, a Hollywood production designed to win a Cold War propaganda battle? The stakes couldn't be higher. We're not just talking about whether a few astronauts planted a flag on another celestial body. We're talking about the integrity of human achievement, the trustworthiness of governments, the very nature of truth itself in an age where reality can be questioned with a simple internet search. Here's what makes this question so fascinating and so maddening at the same time. Unlike most conspiracy theories that exist in the shadows, fed by whispers and speculation, the moon landing controversy exists despite an avalanche of evidence. We're not talking about a few grainy photographs or dubious witness testimonies. We're talking about hundreds of pounds of moon rocks analyzed by laboratories on every continent. We're talking about scientific instruments left on the lunar surface that scientists still use today, bouncing laser beams off them to measure the distance between Earth and Moon with incredible precision. We're talking about high-resolution photographs from modern lunar orbiters that show the landing sites in crisp detail, revealing the tracks left by astronauts and their lunar rovers, shadows of equipment that hasn't moved in over 5 decades. Yet the doubt persists. Why? Perhaps because the achievement seems almost impossible. Think about what we're asking you to believe. In 1969, less than 70 years after the Wright brothers first took to the air in a contraption of wood and fabric, less than 15 years after the first satellites began orbiting Earth, humans supposedly traveled nearly 250,000 miles through the deadly vacuum of space, landed on another world with no atmosphere and extreme temperature swings, walked around in bulky suits, drove a car, played golf, collected rocks, and then flew back home safely, all with computers less powerful than your smartphone. When you put it that way, it does sound absurd, doesn't it? But here's the thing about seemingly impossible achievements. They become possible when brilliant minds, unlimited resources, and desperate motivation collide. And in the 1960s, those 3 elements came together in a perfect storm. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an existential struggle, a Cold War that threatened to turn hot at any moment. Nuclear weapons hung over humanity like a sword suspended by a thread. The space race wasn't just about exploration or scientific discovery. It was about proving which system, capitalism or communism, was superior. It was about demonstrating technological might that could be translated into military power. It was about winning hearts and minds across the globe. When President Kennedy stood before Congress and declared that America would put a man on the moon before the decade was out, he wasn't making a scientific prediction. He was drawing a line in the cosmic sand. Let's set the scene properly, because understanding why the moon landings happened the way they did requires understanding the world they happened in. Imagine living in a time when the future felt genuinely uncertain. Not the way we worry about climate change or artificial intelligence today, but a bone-deep fear that tomorrow might bring nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of apocalypse. American school children were practicing duck and cover drills, as if hiding under a desk would save them from a hydrogen bomb. The Soviet Union seemed to be winning the space race at every turn. They launched the first satellite, Sputnik, whose beeping signal sent shockwaves through American society. They sent the first living creature into space, a dog named Laika who never came home. They sent the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, whose smile beamed from every Soviet propaganda poster. The first woman in space? Soviet. The first spacewalk? Soviet. The first photographs of the far side of the moon? Soviet. America was losing, and losing badly. Each Soviet success felt like a punch to the national gut, a demonstration that maybe, just maybe, the communist system really was superior. Scientists and engineers were defecting to the Soviet Union. Students around the world were learning Russian, assuming that the language of the future would be spoken in Moscow, not Washington. American politicians panicked. Military generals fumed. Scientists scrambled. And then Kennedy made his promise. Before this decade is out, we will land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. Not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. It was a promise that seemed almost reckless. NASA had barely managed to put a man in space for 15 minutes. The technology needed to reach the moon didn't exist yet. The rockets that could carry enough fuel and payload hadn't been built. The spacecraft that could survive the journey hadn't been designed. The spacesuits that could protect astronauts hadn't been tested. The navigation systems that could guide a spacecraft across the void hadn't been invented. The communication systems that could maintain contact across 250,000 miles hadn't been developed. It was like promising to climb Mount Everest when you haven't yet learned to tie your shoelaces. But Kennedy's promise unleashed something extraordinary. Money poured into NASA like water from a broken dam. At the peak of the Apollo program, NASA's budget consumed more than 4% of the entire federal budget. Today, it receives less than half of 1%. In 1960s dollars, the Apollo program cost about $25 billion. In today's money, that's well over $200 billion. For comparison, the entire Manhattan Project that built the first atomic bomb cost about $28 billion in today's dollars. The Apollo program was more expensive than building the weapon that ended World War II and ushered in the nuclear age. Factories across America retooled to produce components for the space program. Universities created new departments dedicated to aerospace engineering and planetary science. An entire generation of the brightest minds in physics, mathematics, engineering, chemistry, and medicine devoted their careers to solving the problems that stood between humanity and the moon. We're not talking about a few dozen people working in secret. We're talking about 400,000 people, spread across thousands of companies, working on thousands of different components, all of which had to function perfectly in the most hostile environment imaginable. The rockets alone were monuments to human ambition. The Saturn V, the massive vehicle that would carry astronauts to the moon, stood as tall as a 30-story building. When fully fueled, it weighed more than 6 million pounds. Think about that for a moment. 6 million pounds. That's the weight of about 800 fully loaded school buses, all of which had to be lifted off the ground and accelerated to speeds fast enough to escape Earth's gravitational pull. The engines that powered the first stage generated a combined thrust of 7.5 million pounds. When those engines ignited, the ground shook for miles around. The sound was so loud it could be heard from the coast 10 miles away, as clearly as if you were standing next to a freight train. But power alone wasn't enough. The spacecraft had to be precise. Imagine trying to throw a dart from New York to hit a bullseye in London, except the bullseye is moving, and you're moving, and the dart has to adjust its course mid-flight. That's essentially what navigating to the moon required. The margin for error was razor thin. A tiny mistake in the angle or velocity could send the spacecraft sailing past the moon into the void, or worse, slamming into the lunar surface at thousands of miles per hour. The computers that handled these calculations were primitive by today's standards. The Apollo guidance computer had less processing power than a modern car key. Yet it worked. It calculated trajectories, adjusted course, controlled the engines, monitored systems, all while operating in the harsh conditions of space where a single malfunction could spell death for the crew. Speaking of death, let's talk about the very real dangers the astronauts faced. Space is not a forgiving environment. There's no air, obviously, which means no breathing without a life support system. There's radiation from the sun and from cosmic rays that can penetrate flesh and damage DNA. There are temperature extremes that swing from blistering hot in direct sunlight to freezing cold in shadow. There are micrometeoroids, tiny particles of dust and rock traveling at speeds that make bullets look slow, any one of which could puncture a spacesuit or spacecraft hull. There's the psychological toll of being so far from home that Earth appears as just a tiny blue marble, knowing that help is literally impossible if something goes wrong. The astronauts knew all this. They weren't naive. Before the moon landings, America had already lost 3 astronauts in a horrific fire during a ground test of Apollo 1. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee burned to death in their spacecraft, trapped by a door that opened inward and couldn't be opened against the pressure of the fire. The nation mourned. NASA investigated. Changes were made. But the program continued because the goal was too important, the promise too public, the competition too fierce. The Soviet Union wasn't sitting idle. They had their own moon program, conducted in absolute secrecy. We know now that they were building their own giant rocket, the N-1, designed to carry cosmonauts to the moon before the Americans. They tested it 4 times. It failed catastrophically every single time. One explosion was so massive, it destroyed the launch pad and killed dozens of people. But none of this was public knowledge at the time. To the world, the Soviets appeared confident, dismissive even, claiming they had never been interested in a moon race at all. They said they were focused on more important goals, like building space stations and sending robotic probes to other planets. This dismissal, this pretense of disinterest, would later become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence that the moon landings were real. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's understand what the conspiracy theorists claim. Their arguments vary in sophistication, but the core assertion is simple. NASA, under pressure from the government and facing technical difficulties that made a real moon landing impossible, faked the entire thing. The astronauts never left Earth orbit. The moonwalks were filmed in a television studio, possibly in the Nevada desert, possibly on a Hollywood soundstage. The rocks were fabricated or collected from Antarctica. The photographs were staged with lighting and backdrops. The video was carefully choreographed and filmed in slow motion to simulate the moon's lower gravity. Why would NASA do this? The conspiracy theorists point to the intense pressure of the Cold War. America was losing the space race. The Soviets were ahead in every category. Kennedy had made an impossible promise, and the deadline was approaching. Better to fake success than admit defeat, they argue. Better to maintain the illusion of American technological superiority than reveal weakness to an adversary who might interpret that weakness as an invitation to aggression. The stakes were too high, the consequences of failure too severe. So NASA, with the help of the government and the military, staged the greatest hoax in history. To support these claims, conspiracy theorists point to anomalies they claim to see in the photographs and video footage. The American flag appears to wave, even though there's no wind on the moon. The shadows fall in different directions, suggesting multiple light sources like you'd have in a studio. The lighting looks too perfect, too even, as if it was carefully staged. There are no stars visible in the black lunar sky, which skeptics say proves the footage was shot against a backdrop. The crosshairs that cameras printed on the images appear to go behind objects in some photos, suggesting the images were manipulated. Astronauts jump and move in ways that look like they could be achieved with simple wirework and slow-motion cameras. Some conspiracy theorists go further, weaving elaborate stories involving famous filmmaker Stanley Kubrick. They claim that Kubrick, fresh off his realistic depiction of space in the film 2001, A Space Odyssey, was recruited by NASA to film fake moon landings. They point to supposed clues Kubrick left in his later films, particularly The Shining, which they interpret as a confession of his involvement. The numbers on the carpet, the patterns on the walls, the dialogue in certain scenes, all supposedly contain hidden messages about the moon landing hoax. These theories have persisted for decades, gaining new life with the internet. Websites, forums, and video channels dedicated to proving the moon landings were faked proliferate online. Some conspiracy theorists have made careers out of promoting these ideas, writing books, producing documentaries, giving lectures. The theories have become so pervasive that a significant percentage of people in various countries express doubt about whether the moon landings actually happened. Polls suggest that as many as 1 in 20 Americans, 1 in 4 Britons, and more than 1 in 4 Russians believe the landings were faked or express uncertainty. This is where our investigation truly begins. Because we're not going to simply dismiss these questions. We're not going to tell you to trust authority or accept the official story without examination. Instead, we're going to look at the evidence, all of it. The physical evidence, the scientific evidence, the photographic evidence, the testimony of thousands of people, the actions of America's greatest adversary at the time, the technical realities of what it would have taken to fake something so elaborate. And we're going to do this in a way that respects both the genuine curiosity of skeptics and the integrity of one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. But before we dive into the evidence, let's acknowledge something important. The fact that people doubt the moon landings isn't entirely unreasonable. Governments have lied before. Intelligence agencies have conducted secret operations. The same government that supposedly put men on the moon also conducted secret experiments on its own citizens, overthrew foreign governments, and misled the public about wars. Trust in institutions has eroded, and not without cause. In an age where video can be faked with computers, where photographs can be doctored seamlessly, where artificial intelligence can generate realistic but entirely fictional footage, skepticism isn't just understandable, it's healthy. What makes the moon landing conspiracy unique is that it occurred before the digital age. The technology to fake something so elaborate simply didn't exist in 1969. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll examine that claim in detail later. For now, let's establish what we need to prove. If the moon landings were real, there should be physical evidence that humans were there. There should be scientific data that could only have come from instruments placed on the moon. There should be photographs from multiple independent sources showing the landing sites. There should be explanations for every supposed anomaly in the footage. There should be reasons why the Soviet Union, with every incentive to expose an American hoax, remained silent. There should be testimony from thousands of people involved in the program, none of whom broke ranks to reveal the alleged fraud. There should be technological analysis showing that faking the footage would have been more difficult than actually going to the moon. That's a high bar. But if we're going to claim that humans walked on another world, if we're going to hold up the moon landings as one of our species' crowning achievements, then we need to meet that bar. We need to present evidence so overwhelming, so comprehensive, so verified by independent sources that doubt becomes irrational. Can we do that? Let's find out. Let's start with something tangible, something you can touch, something that has been examined by thousands of scientists across the globe for more than 50 years. Let's talk about moon rocks. The moon rocks brought back by Apollo missions are perhaps the most concrete evidence we have that humans went to the moon. And when we say concrete, we mean literally physical objects that you can hold in your hand. Objects that have been sliced, analyzed, tested, and scrutinized by laboratories on every continent. Between 1969 and 1972, 6 Apollo missions brought back a total of about 842 pounds of lunar material. That's rocks, soil, dust, and core samples. We're not talking about a handful of pebbles that could easily be faked. We're talking about nearly half a ton of material, representing more than 2,200 individual samples collected from 6 different locations on the Moon. Let's put that in perspective. 842 pounds might not sound like much. It's about the weight of 4 or 5 average adults. But every single ounce of that material had to be lifted off the lunar surface, loaded into a spacecraft, carried across the void of space, and brought through Earth's atmosphere without burning up. The fuel cost alone to bring back that much mass from the Moon was enormous. Each pound of moon rock required hundreds of pounds of rocket fuel to return. NASA didn't bring back rocks for fun or for show. They brought them back because those rocks held secrets about the Moon's formation, about the early solar system, about the history of impacts and volcanic activity, secrets that could only be unlocked by getting the actual material into the hands of scientists. The first thing you need to understand about moon rocks is that they're different from Earth rocks in ways that are immediately obvious to any geologist. Not subtly different, not slightly different, dramatically, fundamentally, unmistakably different. Moon rocks formed in an environment completely unlike Earth. The Moon has no atmosphere, no water, no oxygen, no life, no weathering, no plate tectonics. Every process that shapes rocks on Earth either doesn't exist on the Moon or works completely differently. The result is rocks that look strange, that have unusual compositions, that show evidence of conditions that don't exist anywhere on Earth. Take something called zap pits. These are tiny craters on the surface of moon rocks, created by micrometeorites. On Earth, meteors burn up in the atmosphere. On the Moon, there's no atmosphere to protect the surface. Tiny particles of dust and rock slam into the lunar surface at speeds of many miles per second, creating minuscule impact craters everywhere. When you look at a moon rock under a microscope, you see thousands of these zap pits covering every exposed surface. They're like cosmic bullet holes, evidence of billions of years of bombardment. Could you fake this? Sure, if you wanted to spend decades firing microscopic projectiles at rocks to create thousands of tiny craters on every sample. But why would you bother? Who would even think to fake such a detail in 1969? Or consider something called breccias. These are rocks made from fragments of other rocks that have been smashed together and melted by meteorite impacts. The Moon's surface is covered in breccias because over billions of years, meteorites have been pulverizing and melting the surface repeatedly. The patterns in lunar breccias are complex, chaotic, showing evidence of multiple impact events layered on top of each other. Some fragments in these breccias are themselves breccias, showing multiple generations of impacts. Earth has breccias too, but they're different. Earth's breccias form from volcanism, or from the grinding action of glaciers, or from the movement of tectonic plates. Lunar breccias show a completely different formation process. Then there's the age. Moon rocks are old, really old. The oldest ones are nearly as old as the solar system itself, about 4.5 billion years. That's older than any rock ever found on Earth. Earth's oldest rocks are about 4 billion years old, and even those are incredibly rare. Most rocks on Earth's surface are much younger because Earth is geologically active. Tectonic plates move, recycling old crust into the mantle. Volcanoes create new rock. Weathering breaks down old rock. The Moon has none of this. The Moon's surface is ancient, a museum of the solar system's early history. How do we know how old these rocks are? Through radiometric dating, a technique that measures the decay of radioactive elements. Certain isotopes decay at a known rate, creating what scientists call a radioactive clock. By measuring the ratio of parent isotopes to daughter isotopes in a rock sample, scientists can calculate how long ago that rock solidified. This isn't guesswork. This isn't opinion. This is physics. The decay rates of radioactive isotopes are constants of nature, as reliable as the speed of light. And when dozens of laboratories around the world, using different techniques, analyzing different samples, all arrive at similar ages for moon rocks, that's powerful evidence. But here's what really seals the deal about moon rocks. They've been studied by scientists who have nothing to do with NASA, who work for foreign governments, who have no reason to participate in an American conspiracy. When Apollo 11 brought back the first samples, NASA didn't hoard them. They distributed samples to laboratories worldwide. Samples went to British universities, to French research institutes, to German laboratories, to Japanese scientists, to Soviet scientists. Yes, you read that right. Even during the Cold War, NASA sent moon rock samples to the Soviet Union. Why would America's greatest adversary, a country with every incentive to expose an American fraud, examine supposed fake moon rocks and say nothing? More than 100 countries received samples. Thousands of scientists studied them. Not one said they were fake. Some of the most detailed analyses came from laboratories that had no connection to NASA or the American government. The Soviet Union, which had its own moon program and had brought back small samples using robotic missions, compared their samples to the Apollo samples. The composition matched, the age matched, the structure matched. These weren't identical samples from the same location, obviously, but they were clearly from the same body. Soviet scientists, working for a government that would have loved nothing more than to embarrass the United States by proving the moon landings were fake, confirmed that the American samples were genuine lunar material. Let's talk about what moon rocks are made of. The composition tells a story. Moon rocks contain familiar elements like silicon, oxygen, iron, magnesium, calcium. But the ratios are different from Earth rocks. The moon is depleted in volatile elements, things that evaporate easily. There's very little water in moon rocks, not even locked in mineral structures the way you find in many Earth rocks. There's less zinc, less potassium, less sodium. These depletions match theories about the moon's formation. Scientists think the moon formed from debris after a massive collision between early Earth and a Mars-sized object. Such a collision would have vaporized volatile elements, explaining why the moon is depleted in them. The rocks also contain isotopes in ratios that don't match Earth rocks, but do match what we'd expect from the moon. For example, oxygen has 3 stable isotopes. The ratio of these isotopes is slightly different on Earth and the moon. Not by much, but enough that mass spectrometers can detect the difference. Moon rocks show the lunar signature. You can't fake isotope ratios. Well, you could in theory, if you enriched or depleted specific isotopes. But that would require nuclear reprocessing facilities and would cost billions of dollars. For what? To fool geochemists who wouldn't even develop the techniques to measure these ratios precisely until years after Apollo? Some conspiracy theorists suggest the rocks could have been collected from Antarctica, where meteorites from the moon occasionally land. And yes, we've found lunar meteorites in Antarctica. But here's the thing. Lunar meteorites are rare, small, and look different from Apollo samples. Meteorites that fall to Earth go through a violent process. They're heated to extreme temperatures as they plunge through the atmosphere, creating a fusion crust. They're often fractured or fragmented by the impact. They've been exposed to Earth's environment, absorbing water and other contaminants. Apollo samples show none of this. They have no fusion crust. They show no atmospheric heating. They're pristine examples of lunar surface material, collected carefully and preserved in vacuum-sealed containers. Moreover, we didn't discover the first lunar meteorite until 1982, more than a decade after the last Apollo mission. If NASA had been collecting lunar meteorites from Antarctica in the late 60s to fake moon rocks, they would have needed to know where to look and what to look for before anyone in the scientific community knew that lunar meteorites existed. That's beyond implausible. That's impossible. The variety of samples also matters. Apollo missions visited 6 different sites, each geologically distinct. The samples from each site are different, reflecting local geology. Apollo 11 landed in a relatively smooth mare, a flat plain filled with ancient lava. The rocks from that site are basalts, volcanic rocks, rich in iron and titanium. Apollo 12 landed in a different mare, ocean of storms, and brought back similar but distinct basalts. Apollo 14 visited an area near Cone Crater and found breccias, impact-smashed rocks. Apollo 15 explored the Hadley Apennine region, where mountains meet plains, and found both volcanic rocks and ancient highland material. Apollo 16 landed in the highlands and brought back an orthosite, a light-colored rock type that makes up the moon's ancient crust. Apollo 17 visited Taurus Littrow Valley and found orange soil, volcanic glass from ancient fire fountain eruptions. Each site's samples are consistent with what orbital observations predicted before the missions. Scientists using telescopes had mapped the moon's surface, identifying mare basalts, highlands, impact craters, volcanic features. The Apollo missions confirmed these interpretations. The samples matched the predictions. If you were faking this, you'd need to manufacture rocks that matched not just general lunar characteristics, but specific local geology at 6 different sites. You'd need to anticipate what scientists expected to find based on remote observations, and then create fake samples that confirmed those expectations without contradicting them. All while making sure thousands of scientists examining these rocks with techniques you can't even imagine wouldn't notice the fraud. Let's talk about something called creep rocks. These are rocks enriched in potassium, rare earth elements, and phosphorus. The name creep is an acronym, a bit of scientific whimsy. Creep rocks are thought to be remnants of the last liquid to crystallize as the moon's magma ocean solidified. They're geologically significant because they tell us about the moon's early history. Apollo samples contained creep rocks. Before Apollo, no one predicted creep. Scientists didn't know it existed. After Apollo, lunar scientists developed theories about the moon's magma ocean, partly to explain creep. If you were faking moon rocks, how would you know to include this unexpected type of material? How would you know the right chemical composition, the right minerals, the right textures? The storage and curation of moon rocks is itself evidence of their authenticity. NASA built a special facility at Johnson Space Center in Houston to store and study the samples. The Lunar Sample Laboratory is essentially a clean room where samples are kept in pure nitrogen atmospheres to prevent contamination. Scientists who want to study the rocks must submit detailed proposals explaining what they want to do and why. If approved, they receive small samples, sometimes just thin slices or tiny fragments. The samples are tracked meticulously. When scientists finish their studies, unused portions must be returned. The laboratory has distributed nearly 400 samples per year for research and education, and the chain of custody for every fragment is documented. If these rocks were fake, maintaining the deception would require dozens of people who work at this facility to be part of the conspiracy. Curators, technicians, scientists, all keeping silent for decades. More than that, every visiting scientist who studied samples, thousands of them from dozens of countries, would need to be fooled or complicit. Remember, these aren't casual observers. These are people who've devoted their careers to studying rocks. They know what to look for. They use the most sophisticated analytical techniques available. Electron microscopes that can reveal structures smaller than wavelengths of light. Mass spectrometers that can measure isotope ratios to parts per million. X-ray diffractometers that can identify mineral structures. None of these scientists, not one out of thousands, has claimed the rocks are fake. Some samples have been given as gifts to foreign dignitaries, displayed in museums, used in educational programs. A small piece of moon rock sits in a lucite case in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, where millions of visitors have seen it. Another piece is in London's Science Museum. Others are scattered across the globe in various institutions. Each genuine sample reinforces the whole story. If one were proven fake, the entire narrative would collapse. But they're not fake. Chemical analysis confirms they're consistent with each other and with our understanding of lunar geology. There's also something beautifully ironic about the moon rocks as evidence. Conspiracy theorists often claim that NASA has a vested interest in maintaining the hoax, that American scientists can't be trusted because they're biased. But moon rocks undermine that argument because they've been the subject of so much international, independent research. A Japanese scientist studying a lunar sample at Tokyo University has no reason to protect NASA's reputation. A Russian geochemist analyzing lunar material in Moscow during the height of the Cold War had every reason to expose a fraud. The fact that this hasn't happened, that international scientific consensus supports the authenticity of the samples, is perhaps the strongest evidence of all. Let's address one more claim before moving on. Some conspiracy theorists suggest that even if the rocks are real lunar material, they could have been collected by robotic missions, not human astronauts. After all, the Soviet Union successfully returned lunar samples using the Luna program. Luna 16, Luna 20, and Luna 24 were robotic missions that landed on the moon, scooped up small amounts of soil, and brought them back to Earth. If the Soviets could do this, why couldn't America have done the same and pretended astronauts collected the samples? Here's why that doesn't work. The Soviet robotic missions, impressive as they were, returned tiny amounts of material. All three missions combined brought back about 10.5 ounces. That's about the weight of a cup of flour. The Apollo missions brought back 842 pounds. That's about 80 times more material than all Soviet robotic missions combined. The technology to return that much mass robotically didn't exist. The robots would need to be much larger, more complex, more expensive. They'd need sophisticated drilling and scooping equipment, large sample containers, and powerful rockets to lift all that mass off the lunar surface. The Soviet Union, which was trying desperately to compete with America, could only manage 10 ounces with their best efforts. How could America secretly develop technology to robotically return hundreds of pounds of material? Moreover, the Apollo samples show evidence of careful selection. Astronauts didn't just scoop up whatever was nearby. They chose interesting rocks. They photographed each rock before collection, documenting its context. They described what they were seeing, why they thought a particular sample was worth bringing back. The diversity and quality of the samples reflect human judgment. A robot, following pre-programmed instructions, can't make those kinds of nuanced decisions. It can't notice an unusual rock formation and decide to investigate. It can't see something unexpected and adapt its collection strategy. The Apollo samples bear the fingerprints of human curiosity and expertise. So when we look at moon rocks, what do we see? We see physical evidence that has been examined by thousands of independent scientists for more than 50 years. We see material with properties that match what we'd expect from the moon and don't match anything from Earth. We see samples collected from multiple sites with geologically appropriate diversity. We see confirmation from rival nations who had every reason to cry foul. We see a weight of evidence that makes the idea of fakery absurd. But moon rocks are just the beginning. Physical evidence comes in other forms too. Let's talk about something that sounds like science fiction, but is absolutely real. Something that's still being used by scientists today, more than 50 years after astronauts placed it on the lunar surface. Let's talk about retroreflectors and the laser beams we bounce off them. Imagine standing on Earth and shining a flashlight at the moon. The beam would spread out as it traveled, growing wider and wider. By the time it reached the moon, that beam would be enormous, miles across, and the light that bounced back would spread even more as it returned to Earth. Detecting that faint return signal would be nearly impossible. like trying to spot a single firefly in a stadium full of searchlights. This is the problem with using the moon's natural surface for laser ranging experiments. You can do it. Scientists proved that before Apollo. But the precision is terrible. The lunar surface scatters light in all directions, returning only a tiny fraction toward your detector. The solution is elegant. Place mirrors on the moon that reflect light directly back toward its source. Not just any mirrors, but special ones called retroreflectors, designed to send light back parallel to the direction it came from, regardless of the angle of arrival. Think of the reflectors on a bicycle or a street sign. No matter where you stand, they shine back at you. Retroreflectors work on the same principle, but are far more sophisticated. Apollo astronauts left 3 of these retroreflector arrays on the moon. Apollo 11 placed one at Tranquility Base, Apollo 14 left one at Fra Mauro, and Apollo 15 deployed the largest array at Hadley Base. Soviet robotic missions also left 2 smaller retroreflectors, but we'll focus on the Apollo ones because they've been used most extensively. Each retroreflector consists of an array of special prisms called corner cubes. A corner cube is like the inside corner of a box, where 3 perpendicular surfaces meet. Light entering a corner cube bounces off all 3 surfaces and emerges parallel to its original path, but traveling in the opposite direction. It's a quirk of geometry, beautiful in its simplicity. The Apollo retroreflectors contain many corner cubes arranged in a panel. Apollo 11 and 14's arrays have 100 corner cubes each. Apollo 15's array is larger, with 300 corner cubes, making it the most frequently used target for laser ranging experiments. The retroreflectors were designed to survive the harsh lunar environment. The moon has no atmosphere to moderate temperature, so surfaces in direct sunlight can reach temperatures hotter than boiling water, while surfaces in shadow drop colder than Antarctica's winters. The temperature swings are extreme, and they happen quickly as the sun rises and sets over the 2-week lunar day-night cycle. The retroreflectors had to handle these thermal stresses without warping or cracking. They also had to survive micrometeorite bombardment, solar radiation, and cosmic rays. The fact that they're still working after more than 50 years is a testament to the engineering that went into designing them. So, how do these retroreflectors prove humans went to the moon? Simple. We shoot lasers at them and measure how long it takes for the light to come back. Light travels at a fixed speed, the speed of light, one of the fundamental constants of the universe. If you know how long it takes light to make the round trip from Earth to Moon and back, you can calculate the distance with incredible precision. And by incredible precision, we mean millimeter accuracy, over a 250,000 mile distance. That's like measuring the distance between New York and Los Angeles, and being accurate to less than the width of your fingernail. Multiple observatories around the world participate in lunar laser ranging experiments. The McDonald Observatory in Texas was the first to successfully detect a signal from the Apollo 11 retroreflector, just days after the astronauts deployed it. Other facilities joined over the years: the Observatoire de la Côte d'Azur in France, Apache Point Observatory in New Mexico, observatories in Russia, Germany, and elsewhere. These aren't NASA facilities. They're independent scientific institutions operated by universities and research organizations. They're shooting lasers at the moon, detecting the returning photons, and calculating distances. All of them get consistent results that match the known locations of the retroreflectors. The measurements have taught us an enormous amount about the Earth-Moon system. For instance, we know the moon is slowly spiraling away from Earth, receding at a rate of about 1.5 inches per year. That might not sound like much, but over millions of years, it adds up. Billions of years ago, the moon was much closer to Earth, which means tides were stronger and days were shorter. Laser ranging confirmed what physicists predicted based on tidal theory. The moon's gravitational pull creates tides in Earth's oceans. Those tides create friction that slows Earth's rotation and pushes the moon farther away. It's a beautiful example of physics in action, and we can measure it thanks to retroreflectors on the moon. Laser ranging also tests Einstein's theory of general relativity. Relativity predicts that gravity isn't just a force, but a curvature of spacetime. Massive objects like Earth and the Moon warp the space around them, and this warping affects how objects move and how light travels. By measuring the Moon's orbit with such precision, scientists can test predictions of general relativity that would be impossible to test any other way. So far, after decades of measurements, general relativity has passed every test. The Moon's motion matches Einstein's predictions to within the measurement error. That's a powerful confirmation of our understanding of gravity. But let's get back to the conspiracy theory angle. Could retroreflectors have been placed on the Moon by robots instead of astronauts? Technically, yes. As mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union did place 2 smaller retroreflectors using robotic missions. But here's the problem with that explanation: timing. The Apollo 11 retroreflector started returning signals in August of 1969, just weeks after the Apollo 11 mission. The first Soviet retroreflector wasn't placed until November of 1970, with the Lunar 1 mission. That means America would have needed to secretly develop robotic landing technology more than a year before the Soviet Union. A country that was ahead in robotic space exploration at the time managed to do it. Moreover, America would have needed to do this 3 times, placing retroreflectors at 3 different locations, all while maintaining the fiction of human missions. Think about the logistics. A robotic mission capable of landing on the Moon, deploying a retroreflector, and doing so precisely enough that Earth-based observatories could find it and hit it with laser beams, would require significant development. You can't just drop a retroreflector and hope for the best. It needs to be aimed correctly, pointed at Earth. The angle matters. A retroreflector that's tilted too much won't return a strong signal. The Apollo astronauts carefully leveled their retroreflectors using bubble levels and adjustable legs. Could a robot do this? Maybe, but it would need sophisticated sensors and actuators. It would need to communicate with Earth to confirm correct alignment. All of this would leave a trail, radio transmissions that could be detected, engineering work that hundreds of people would know about. And then, there's the question of why. If America had the technology to land robots on the Moon capable of deploying retroreflectors, why bother with the elaborate human mission hoax? Just send the robots, claim you placed retroreflectors robotically, and call it a day. The fact that retroreflectors exist on the Moon proves nothing about whether humans place them, conspiracy theorists argue. But combined with everything else, with the Moon rocks, with the photographs, with the testimony of thousands of people, retroreflectors add another piece to the puzzle. They're evidence that sophisticated equipment was placed at precise locations on the Moon during the Apollo program's timeline. Equipment that's still functioning today. Equipment that independent scientists around the world can verify exists by bouncing laser beams off it. There's also something to be said about the deterioration of the retroreflectors. Scientists have noticed that the return signal has been weakening over time. Not dramatically, but measurably. The Apollo 15 array, once the strongest reflector, has lost some of its efficiency. Why? Probably because lunar dust has accumulated on the reflectors. The Moon has no wind, but meteorite impacts kick up dust that drifts back down slowly. Over decades, a thin layer of dust has settled on the retroreflectors, absorbing some of the incoming light and reducing the return signal. This gradual degradation is exactly what you'd expect from equipment sitting on the lunar surface for 50+ years. If the retroreflectors were in a studio somewhere on Earth, being used to perpetuate a hoax, their performance wouldn't degrade in this particular way. They'd either work consistently or fail catastrophically, not show a gradual decline consistent with dust accumulation in a vacuum environment. The science that's come from lunar laser ranging is extensive and ongoing. Researchers continue to use the Apollo retroreflectors to refine our measurements of the Earth-Moon distance, to study the Moon's interior structure by analyzing how it responds to Earth's gravitational pull, to test fundamental physics by looking for tiny deviations from general relativity's predictions. Papers are published every year using data from these experiments. International teams of scientists collaborate on the measurements and analysis. The retroreflectors are a living, functioning part of modern astronomy and physics research. If the Apollo missions were faked, then dozens of observatories around the world are somehow participating in the deception, year after year, decade after decade, for no clear benefit. French scientists would need to be in on it. German scientists would need to be complicit. Russian scientists, despite working for a government that was America's adversary during the Cold War, would need to maintain the fiction. University researchers, graduate students, telescope operators, all lying in concert to pretend they're bouncing laser beams off retroreflectors placed by astronauts when they're actually, what? Bouncing them off secret robot installations that no one talks about? The conspiracy required to maintain this single aspect of the moon landing story would be immense, involving people who have no connection to NASA, no allegiance to the American government, and no reason to lie. But physical evidence on the moon's surface isn't limited to rocks and retroreflectors. In recent years, we've gained the ability to photograph the Apollo landing sites from lunar orbit with resolution high enough to see not just the big landing modules, but the smaller items left behind, even the tracks left by astronauts walking on the surface. This is the final nail in the coffin for claims that the landings were faked, the kind of evidence that even the most dedicated conspiracy theorist struggles to dismiss. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO, launched in 2009, carries a camera system capable of photographing the moon's surface with remarkable detail. From its low-altitude orbit, it can resolve features smaller than a person. The LRO isn't a NASA propaganda tool operating in secret. Its camera system was designed by a team at Arizona State University. Its data is publicly available. Any researcher can access the images, analyze them, verify their authenticity. And what LRO has shown us is nothing short of extraordinary. All 6 Apollo landing sites have been photographed. Not from far away where you'd just see a blur. From close up, with enough resolution to make out individual pieces of equipment. You can see the descent stages of the lunar modules, the bottom portions that were left behind when astronauts lifted off to return to orbit. These are the bulky, boxy structures with landing legs that served as the astronauts' launch pad for their journey home. Each descent stage is right where it should be, at the location NASA claimed astronauts landed. At the Apollo 11 site in the Sea of Tranquility, you can see the Eagle descent stage. You can see the laser-ranging retroreflector we just discussed. You can see the passive seismic experiment package, an instrument that measured moonquakes. You can see faint trails of disturbed regolith, the lunar soil, marking the paths where Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked. The trails lead from the lunar module to the experiment packages, to the area where they collected samples, patterns consistent with the movements documented in mission transcripts and photographs. Apollo 12's landing site in the Ocean of Storms shows Intrepid's descent stage, the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package, a more sophisticated set of instruments than Apollo 11 deployed, and something wonderfully unexpected. You can see footprints leading to an old robotic spacecraft, Surveyor 3, that had landed years earlier. The Apollo 12 mission specifically targeted a landing near Surveyor 3, so astronauts could retrieve parts of the spacecraft to study how it had weathered the lunar environment. Mission photographs show astronauts examining Surveyor 3, and LRO images confirm the Surveyor spacecraft is there, exactly where it should be, with astronaut paths leading to and from it. Apollo 14 landed in the Fra Mauro Highlands, a region chosen because it was originally supposed to be Apollo 13's destination, before that mission's famous oxygen tank explosion forced an abort. LRO images show the Antares descent stage, the retro-reflector array, the experiment package, and trails of footprints snaking across the regolith. One trail leads to the rim of Cone Crater, where astronauts Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell hiked to collect samples. The trail matches maps drawn from mission photographs and matches the routes described in crew communications. Apollo 15 was the first mission to carry the lunar roving vehicle, a car designed to let astronauts travel farther from their landing site. LRO photographs of the Hadley Apennine region show the Falcon descent stage and the rover parked nearby, exactly where astronauts David Scott and James Irwin left it. You can see tracks from the rover crisscrossing the area, wide parallel lines pressed into the lunar soil. The tracks lead to different geological sites that the astronauts visited. You can see where they stopped to collect samples, where they deployed instruments, where they turned around to head back. The pattern of tracks matches video footage taken by a camera mounted on the rover, showing the actual drives across this terrain. Apollo 16's landing site in the Descartes Highlands shows the Orion descent stage, another rover, more tracks, more equipment. The rover's tracks lead up to the edge of craters, to boulders where astronauts collected samples, tracing the same routes documented in mission records. Apollo 17, the final mission, landed in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, a dramatic location between mountains. LRO images show the Challenger descent stage, the rover, tracks everywhere. Apollo 17 spent more time on the surface than any other mission. Astronauts Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt drove the rover more than 20 miles total, the farthest any humans have traveled on another world. Their tracks create a complex web of paths, and every one of them matches the mission's documented activities. The quality of these images is extraordinary. They're not blurry or ambiguous. They're crisp, detailed photographs that show exactly what you'd expect to see if humans had actually visited these locations. The equipment is there. The tracks are there. The arrangement matches mission photographs and documentation. Some images are so detailed you can see the shadows cast by equipment, shadows whose length and direction match the sun angle at the time LRO photographed the site. But LRO wasn't the first to photograph the landing sites. Other nations have also sent orbiters to the moon, and they've independently confirmed what LRO showed. Japan's Kaguya orbiter, launched in 2007, photographed evidence of Apollo 15's landing. Its cameras caught something remarkable: the bright patch of disturbed soil where the Falcon's descent engine blasted away the dark surface dust during landing. The brightness difference is visible from orbit because the engine exhaust exposed lighter material underneath. This matches photographs taken from the Apollo 15 command module showing the same bright patch just after landing. India's Chandrayaan-2 orbiter captured images of the Apollo 11 landing site in 2021. Their high-resolution camera photographed Tranquility Base and clearly showed the Eagle descent stage. This was India's space agency, a completely independent organization with no connection to NASA or American space policy, confirming that yes, there's hardware at the Apollo 11 landing site, exactly where NASA said astronauts landed. China has also sent orbiters to the moon, and while they haven't specifically focused on photographing Apollo sites, their mapping data is consistent with the terrain features visible in Apollo photographs. If the landing sites were somehow fabricated, if the equipment seen in LRO images was secretly placed there, Chinese lunar mapping would likely show inconsistencies or anomalies. It doesn't. The convergence of evidence from multiple independent sources is what makes the photographic evidence so compelling. It's not just NASA claiming there's equipment on the moon. It's pictures from different orbiters, operated by different countries, all showing the same things. And those things match historical photographs taken during the missions. You can take an Apollo photograph of, say, the lunar module with a mountain in the background, then find that same mountain in LRO imagery, and see the module sitting in front of it exactly as the Apollo photograph showed. Some conspiracy theorists try to dismiss the orbital photographs by claiming they could be faked, that LRO could be generating false images. But LRO isn't just snapping random pictures. It's conducting a comprehensive survey of the entire lunar surface, building detailed topographic maps used by scientists worldwide for research on lunar geology, crater dating, volcanic history, and planning for future missions. Chinese scientists use LRO data. Russian scientists use it. European scientists use it. The data is consistent across all of it. To fake the Apollo landing sites, you'd need to fake tiny portions of a vast database in ways that are consistent with everything around them, with topography that matches historic photographs, with features that correspond to geological observations. The scope of such a deception would be staggering. There's also the matter of the flags. 5 of the 6 American flags planted by Apollo astronauts are still standing. LRO images show their shadows. The only exception is the Apollo 11 flag, which Buzz Aldrin reported seeing blow over when the ascent stage's rocket engine fired during liftoff. Sure enough, LRO images of the Apollo 11 site show no flag shadow, while images of the other 5 sites show flag shadows right where you'd expect them. The footprints are another fascinating detail. On Earth, footprints in sand or dirt fade quickly. Rain washes them away. Wind erodes them. Plants grow over them. But the moon has no wind, no rain, no life. Footprints could persist for millions of years, unchanged, except for the occasional small meteorite impact that might obliterate a small area. The footprints photographed by LRO are the same footprints pressed into the regolith by astronauts more than 50 years ago. They'll still be there in 1,000 years, in 1,000,000 years, a permanent record of human achievement. The trails of footprints also tell stories. You can see where astronauts walked from the lunar module to their equipment. You can see where they stopped, creating clustered footprints as they worked. You can see where they went to collect samples, following paths that match the documented timeline of their moonwalks. The patterns are complex, irregular, exactly what you'd expect from humans moving around with purpose, not the simple straight lines you might get if someone was trying to fake it. Let's think about what it would take to fake what LRO has photographed. You'd need to place hardware on the moon at 6 different sites. You'd need descent stages, rovers, experiment packages, flags, all constructed to look exactly like the equipment shown in Apollo photographs. You'd need to create patterns of tracks that match documented mission activities. You'd need to do all this without being detected by any of the numerous orbiters that have mapped the moon, including those operated by other countries. You'd need to maintain this deception for decades, while allowing independent observatories to bounce laser beams off retroreflectors at 3 of these sites. The complexity of such a hoax would be mind-boggling, far more difficult than actually landing humans on the moon. Moreover, LRO has photographed not just the landing sites, but the entire Apollo flight path. Each mission followed a trajectory that took the astronauts across specific regions of the moon. Those trajectories are visible in photographs taken by the astronauts from their windows, showing lunar surface features from various altitudes and angles. Modern topographic data from LRO and other orbiters can recreate those views. When scientists do this, taking LRO data and recreating what astronauts would have seen from their documented positions, the reconstructed views match the Apollo photographs perfectly. Mountains appear at the correct angles. Craters are in the right places. The scale and perspective align. This is an incredibly difficult thing to fake because it requires not just photographing models or landscapes from the right angles, but creating those photographs in ways that are consistent with comprehensive orbital mapping done decades later by completely different spacecraft. The evidence from orbital photography essentially closes the loop. We have physical samples that prove material came from the moon. We have functioning instruments on the lunar surface that prove equipment was placed there. Now, We have photographs from multiple independent sources showing that this equipment is at specific locations, arranged in ways that match historical documentation, surrounded by tracks and disturbances consistent with human activity. Each piece of evidence supports the others. The moon rocks could have been collected by astronauts at the sites shown in orbital photographs. The retro-reflectors are at sites where descent stages are visible. The tracks lead between equipment in patterns that match mission transcripts describing astronaut movements. It's worth considering the nature of evidence itself. In science, we build confidence through multiple independent lines of evidence that converge on the same conclusion. One measurement might be wrong. One photograph might be misleading. One analysis might have errors. But when dozens of different measurements, thousands of photographs, millions of data points, all analyzed by independent teams using different methods, all point to the same conclusion, that conclusion becomes virtually certain. The moon landings have this kind of support. Physical, chemical, photographic, instrumental, testimonial evidence all confirms that humans walked on the moon. But we're not done yet. We've talked about rocks, retroreflectors, and orbital photographs. These are the tangible, physical, observable pieces of evidence. Yet there's another dimension to this story, one that's perhaps even more compelling when you think about it carefully. It's not about what we can see and measure directly. It's about who would have exposed the hoax if it were fake. It's about the geopolitical situation, about America's greatest rival at the time, about the one nation that had every reason, every incentive, every motivation to prove the moon landings were a fraud. We're talking, of course, about the Soviet Union. Remember where we started this journey. The space race was a Cold War competition between two superpowers who despised each other, who threatened each other with nuclear annihilation, who competed for global influence and ideological supremacy. The Soviet Union was ahead in space achievements. First satellite, first animal in orbit, first human in space, first woman in space, first spacewalk, first pictures of the moon's far side. They were winning. Then America claimed to have won the grand prize, landing humans on the moon. If that claim were false, if it were a hoax, the Soviet Union would have known, and they would have told the world. Consider what the Soviets had at their disposal. They had one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence networks, the KGB, with agents throughout the West. They had scientists and engineers who understood the challenges of space travel intimately, because they were trying to do the same thing. They had tracking stations monitoring radio transmissions from space, powerful enough to detect signals from American spacecraft. They had radar installations that could track objects in space. They had telescopes that could observe the moon. If the Apollo spacecraft never left Earth orbit, if the moonwalks were filmed in a studio, the Soviets would have detected the deception. Let's think about radio transmissions. When Apollo astronauts were on the moon, they communicated with Mission Control in Houston. Those communications were broadcast via radio waves that traveled across the 250,000 miles of space between Earth and Moon. Radio transmissions can be intercepted by anyone with the right equipment. The Soviets had that equipment. They monitored American space missions closely, listening to every transmission, analyzing the signals. Independent tracking stations in other countries did the same. Amateur radio enthusiasts with powerful receivers picked up transmissions from Apollo missions. The interesting thing about radio signals is that they carry information about their source. The Doppler shift, the change in frequency caused by the relative motion between transmitter and receiver, reveals whether the source is moving toward you or away from you, and how fast. By tracking the Doppler shift of Apollo transmissions, listeners could determine the spacecraft's trajectory. Multiple tracking stations around the Earth could triangulate the signal's origin, pinpointing where the transmissions were coming from. All of this data, collected independently by various parties including the Soviets, confirmed that Apollo transmissions were coming from the vicinity of the Moon, not from Earth orbit or from a ground station somewhere. But the Soviets didn't just listen passively. They had their own space program, And during the Apollo 11 mission, they actually had a robotic spacecraft, Luna 15, in lunar orbit at the same time Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface. Luna 15 was attempting to land, scoop up samples, and return them to Earth before Apollo 11 got back, a last-ditch effort to salvage some propaganda victory. The mission failed. Luna 15 crashed into the moon, but the fact that it was there, that Soviet engineers were operating a spacecraft in lunar orbit simultaneously with the American mission, means they had real-time monitoring of the situation. If Apollo 11 wasn't where NASA said it was, if the landing was faked, Soviet tracking would have revealed it instantly. What did the Soviets say about the moon landings? Publicly, they were dismissive, downplaying the achievement, but they never claimed it was fake. Soviet media gave minimal coverage to Apollo 11. Official statements were grudging and brief, but nowhere did they accuse America of fraud. Pravda, the Communist Party newspaper, didn't scream about an American hoax. Soviet scientists didn't publish papers exposing NASA's deception. Why not? If they had proof that America faked the moon landings, revealing that proof would have been the greatest propaganda coup in history. It would have humiliated the United States, undermined Western credibility, vindicated the Soviet system. Yet, they said nothing. Years later, after the Cold War ended and Soviet archives began to open, we learned the truth. The Soviets knew the landings were real because they had tracked the missions, because their own scientists confirmed what American scientists reported, because faking it would have been obvious to them. Vasily Mishin, who led the Soviet moon program after the death of chief designer Sergei Korolev, gave interviews where he discussed how Soviet plans changed after Apollo 11. There was no point in continuing their human moon program, he said, because America had won. The Soviets shifted focus to space stations and other projects where they could still compete. This makes no sense if the moon landings were faked. If Soviet leaders knew it was a hoax, they would have continued their own moon program, exposed the American fraud, and landed their cosmonauts for real. But there's more. The Soviet Union had its own robotic lunar sample return missions, the Luna program. As mentioned earlier, Luna 16, Luna 20, and Luna 24 successfully brought back small amounts of lunar soil. Soviet scientists analyzed these samples and compared them to samples that NASA shared with the international scientific community. The samples matched. Soviet lunar soil and American lunar soil had the same characteristics, the same composition, the same isotopic signatures. If NASA's samples were fake, created in a laboratory, or collected from Antarctica, they wouldn't match soil collected by Soviet robots from completely different lunar locations. But they did match. Think about what this means. Soviet scientists, working for a government that would have loved to embarrass America, examined lunar material that supposedly came from Apollo missions and confirmed it was genuine lunar material. They didn't claim NASA faked the samples. They didn't find inconsistencies. They didn't raise alarms. Instead, they published scientific papers comparing Soviet and American samples, contributing to our understanding of lunar geology. Why would they do this if they knew or suspected the Apollo samples were fake? The Soviet Union also received gifts of moon rocks from America. President Nixon's administration distributed small samples to countries around the world as goodwill gestures. The Soviet Union received samples. Think about that. America gave moon rocks to its greatest adversary. If those rocks were fake, the Soviets would have exposed them. Soviet geologists would have analyzed the samples, discovered they were fraudulent, and held a press conference to inform the world that American moon rocks were actually terrestrial rocks, or synthetic materials. This never happened. The samples given to the Soviet Union, along with samples given to over 100 other countries, all checked out as genuine lunar material. We can also look at Soviet actions during the Apollo program. If Soviet intelligence believed the landings were fake, you'd expect them to intensify their own lunar efforts, to race ahead and expose the American hoax by landing cosmonauts for real. Instead, the opposite happened. After Apollo 11, Soviet lunar ambitions wound down. They canceled development of their N-1 rocket after repeated failures. They shifted resources to other programs. The actions of the Soviet government are consistent with acceptance that America had won the moon race, not with knowledge of an American fraud. There's also the matter of cooperation that developed later. The Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975 brought American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts together in a joint mission. Spacecraft from both nations docked in orbit. Crews worked together. This mission was a symbol of détente, a thawing of Cold War tensions. It required extensive collaboration between NASA and the Soviet space program. Engineers from both sides examined each other's spacecraft, reviewed technical specifications, trained together. If Soviet engineers had known that Apollo missions to the moon were fake, bringing American astronauts who supposedly walked on the moon together with Soviet cosmonauts would have been a bizarre charade. More likely, there would have been quiet blackmail, subtle threats, behind-the-scenes maneuvering. None of this happened. The mission proceeded smoothly. Both sides treated each other with respect, and the collaboration paved the way for future joint ventures, including the International Space Station. It's worth remembering just how hostile relations were between the US and USSR during this period. These were nations that had nearly gone to nuclear war over Cuba, that were fighting proxy wars around the globe, that were spying on each other constantly, that were engaged in intense ideological competition. In this environment, the idea that the Soviets would protect an American hoax is absurd. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose by staying silent if they knew the moon landings were fake. Let's also consider individuals. Cosmonauts and astronauts met at international conferences. They became friends, respected colleagues who understood the challenges each faced. Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, the first human to walk in space, met several Apollo astronauts. He congratulated them, talked shop about spaceflight, discussed technical details. Leonov knew what real spaceflight was like. He'd experienced the dangers, the isolation, the thrill. If he suspected his American counterparts were lying about their experiences, if he had any hint that their moon missions were faked, it's inconceivable he would have maintained cordial relationships with them. Instead, he became friends with Apollo-Soyuz astronaut Tom Stafford. They remained close for decades. Soviet scientists attended international conferences where Apollo results were presented. They reviewed papers based on lunar samples. They collaborated on research. They contributed to the growing body of knowledge about the moon that Apollo had enabled. All of this scientific interaction would have been impossible if there was even a whiff of fraud. Science is a self-correcting process. Scientists challenge each other's results, critique methodology, demand evidence. Soviet scientists, who had every incentive to find flaws in American lunar science, found none. There's an argument conspiracy theorists sometimes make. Maybe the Soviets were in on it. Maybe both superpowers agreed to fake the moon landings to divert attention from other issues, or to justify military spending, or for some other convoluted reason. This doesn't withstand scrutiny. If both sides agreed to fake the landings, why would the Soviet Union continue spending vast resources on their own moon program? Why would they suffer the humiliation of losing the race? Why would they shift their space priorities after Apollo? A joint conspiracy makes no sense given the historical actions of both nations. Moreover, maintaining a conspiracy between Cold War adversaries would be extraordinarily difficult. It would require ongoing communication, coordination, shared secrets. One side could betray the other at any moment for strategic advantage. The risks would be enormous. It's far more plausible that both sides were genuinely competing, that both were pushing the limits of their technology, and that America achieved the moon landing first because they devoted more resources to it sooner and got lucky with their rocket design working, while the Soviet N-1 kept exploding. We should also talk about other countries that tracked the Apollo missions. Britain's Jodrell Bank Observatory used its massive radio telescope to receive signals from Apollo spacecraft. Australian tracking stations at Parkes and Honeysuckle Creek received the television broadcasts of the moonwalks. These weren't American facilities. They were operated by the Australian government under agreements that involved Australian personnel. The technicians and engineers working there were tracking actual spacecraft signals, watching telemetry data flow in real time. If Apollo spacecraft were actually in Earth orbit or on the ground somewhere, these tracking stations would have detected the discrepancy. The angles would be wrong. The signal strength would be wrong. The Doppler shifts would reveal the true location. A group of British amateur astronomers tracked Apollo missions as well. These were private citizens with no connection to NASA, using their own equipment. They calculated orbital trajectories based on their observations and confirmed that the spacecraft were on translunar trajectories, heading to and from the moon. One of these amateurs was a teacher at Kettering Grammar School, who had his students involved in the project. A teacher and his students, with homemade equipment, were able to track Apollo spacecraft and verify their trajectories. This is the opposite of a tightly controlled conspiracy. This is a well-documented public event that anyone with the right equipment could observe. The Spanish tracking station at Fresnadillas also played a role in Apollo communications. Spanish technicians, working for their own government, received transmissions from Apollo spacecraft. France had tracking capabilities. Japan monitored missions. None of these countries reported anomalies. None claimed the signals were coming from somewhere other than where NASA said they were. All of this independent verification makes a hoax essentially impossible, unless you're willing to propose an even more elaborate conspiracy involving dozens of nations, thousands of individuals, and decades of consistent lies, with no one ever breaking ranks. When we step back and look at the geopolitical picture, the Soviet factor becomes perhaps the most powerful evidence that the moon landings were real. It's not just that the Soviets didn't claim the landings were faked. It's that their entire behavior, their actions, their statements, their scientific work, their space program decisions, all are consistent with accepting that America landed humans on the moon. And these were people with every reason to expose a fraud and no reason to protect American interests. The silence of the Soviet Union speaks volumes. When your greatest enemy, the one who would benefit most from exposing your lie, instead treats your claim as true, that's a pretty strong endorsement of your claim's validity. This brings us to another crucial aspect of the moon landing story, one that's often overlooked in conspiracy discussions. Even if someone were inclined to doubt all the evidence we've covered so far, even if they were skeptical of moon rocks and retroreflectors and orbital photographs and Soviet silence, there remains a simple, practical question. Could the Apollo missions have actually been faked with 1960s technology? We're not asking if they should have been faked or why they might have been faked. We're asking a straightforward technical question. Given the state of film, photography, special effects, and computer technology in the 1960s, was it possible to create fake footage and photographs that would have looked real and survived scrutiny for over 50 years? The answer, according to experts in film, photography, and special effects, is a resounding no. Faking the Apollo footage would have been more difficult, more expensive, and more technologically demanding than actually going to the moon. This seems counterintuitive at first. Surely filming something on Earth is easier than traveling to another world? But the details tell a different story, and the details are where the hoax theory falls apart. Let's start with the video footage of astronauts on the moon. The most iconic images show them bouncing in the low lunar gravity, kicking up dust that arcs gracefully in the vacuum, working with equipment in their bulky spacesuits. The movement looks otherworldly because it is otherworldly. It's happening in an environment with 1/6 Earth's gravity and no air resistance. How would you fake this in 1969? Wire work, conspiracy theorists suggest. Hang astronauts from wires, film them in slow motion, and it'll look like they're in low gravity. Except this doesn't actually work. Actors on wires move in specific ways that don't match lunar gravity. When you're suspended by wires, your center of mass is being pulled up from a single point, usually your chest or waist. You move like a puppet, with your limbs hanging down. Real astronauts on the moon weren't being pulled from above. They were standing on a surface with real gravity, just less of it. They had weight pressing their feet down. They moved with inertia. When they jumped, they accelerated upward, and then decelerated symmetrically as they came back down. When they fell, which happened several times and is documented on video, they fell at the rate lunar gravity would produce, about 1/6 the speed you'd fall on Earth. Modern filmmakers have tried to recreate lunar movement for movies. Films like Apollo 13 and First Man employed the latest special effects techniques, including wire work, computer graphics, and clever camera work. Even with decades of advancement in filmmaking technology, these modern productions struggle to perfectly match the look of real lunar footage. Experts can tell the difference. The movement isn't quite right. The dust doesn't behave correctly. Small details give it away. If modern filmmakers with tools that would seem like magic to their 1960s predecessors can't perfectly fake lunar footage, how could NASA have done it in the 60s? Then there's the dust. This is something most people don't think about, but it's crucial. When astronauts walked on the moon, when the lunar rovers drove across the surface, they kicked up dust. That dust behaves in a very specific way. On Earth, dust kicked up by a vehicle billows into clouds that hang in the air because air resistance slows the particles down. On the moon, there's no air. Dust kicked up by the rover or by astronauts' boots follows perfect ballistic arcs. Each particle is a tiny projectile traveling in a parabola determined by its initial velocity and the moon's gravity. The dust doesn't hang in the air because there's no air. It doesn't drift. It goes up, reaches a peak, comes back down, all in smooth curves with no atmospheric interference. You can see this clearly in footage of the rover in motion. As its wheels spin, they throw up fantails of dust that arc out behind the vehicle in perfect parabolas before striking the ground. It looks almost like liquid being sprayed, except it's individual particles, all following ballistic paths. On Earth, if you drive a vehicle through sand or dirt, the dust cloud behaves completely differently. It billows, it swirls, it lingers in the air. The rooster tails of dust behind the lunar rover don't behave like anything on Earth. They behave exactly as they should in a vacuum with 1/6 Earth gravity. Could this have been faked? Only in a massive vacuum chamber with simulated lunar gravity. But in 1969, the largest vacuum chambers were nowhere near big enough to film a rover driving around. And even if you built a chamber big enough, how do you simulate 1/6 gravity consistently across the entire space? Wire work doesn't help because the dust isn't on wires. You'd need to somehow reduce gravitational pull, which is physically impossible with current technology, let alone 60 years ago. Or you'd need to film in a reduced gravity environment like an airplane flying parabolic arcs. But those only give you about 20 seconds of reduced gravity at a time. Not enough for the long, continuous shots we see in lunar footage. The lighting in Apollo photographs is another aspect that would have been extremely difficult to fake. The sun on the moon produces hard, sharp shadows because there's no atmosphere to scatter light. At the same time, the lunar surface itself is reflective, bouncing sunlight back up and partially filling in shadows. The result is a lighting environment that looks harsh, but not pitch black in shadow areas. Some conspiracy theorists claim the lighting looks like studio lighting, with multiple light sources. But analysis shows the exact opposite. The shadows all point in directions consistent with a single light source, the sun. The partial illumination of shadowed areas comes from reflected light off the surface, which is exactly what you'd expect. If you were using studio lights to fake this, you'd have problems. Studio lights in the 60s couldn't match the intensity and quality of sunlight. The sun is incredibly far away, so its light rays are essentially parallel when they reach the moon. Studio lights are close, so their rays diverge from a point source. This creates different shadow patterns. You'd need a light source far enough away to produce parallel rays, bright enough to overpower any other lights, and consistent enough to avoid hot spots or uneven illumination. The technology to create such a light source artificially, powerful enough to light a large set, simply didn't exist. The photographs also show extraordinary detail and dynamic range. Some images have both brightly lit areas in direct sunlight and darker areas in shadow, and you can see detail in both. The cameras used by Apollo astronauts were specially modified Hasselblad cameras with film chosen for the lunar environment. The film had to work in extreme temperatures, in vacuum, under intense solar radiation. Each photograph was manually adjusted by the astronauts for exposure, focus, and framing. Despite these challenges, they captured images that professional photographers consider technically superb. If these photographs were taken on a set, you'd expect occasional glimpses of equipment, lights, stage edges, things that shouldn't be there. With over 8,000 photos publicly available from the Apollo missions, none show such anomalies. No boom microphones accidentally in frame. No lighting rigs visible in reflections. No evidence of backdrops or stage construction. Every photo is consistent with being taken in the actual lunar environment. The television broadcasts present their own challenges to fake. Apollo 11's moonwalk was broadcast live to the world. About 600 million people watched it in real time. If this was filmed in a studio, the broadcast would need to be live, which means no ability to do multiple takes, no editing, no post-production to fix mistakes. Everything would need to work perfectly the first time. The astronauts would need to perform their tasks flawlessly, while somehow producing movement that looked like low gravity, kicking up dust that behaved like it was in vacuum, casting shadows consistent with a distant sun, all while maintaining radio communications that sounded like they were coming from the moon based on signal delay. The choreography required to pull this off live would be far more complex than the actual moonwalk. There's also the matter of consistency across multiple missions. Apollo 11 through Apollo 17, 6 successful lunar landing missions spanning 3 years. Each produced hours of video, thousands of photographs, voice recordings, telemetry data. Every mission was consistent with every other. The lunar environment looked the same across all of them. The behavior of dust, the quality of shadows, the appearance of the sky, all remained constant. If these were Hollywood productions, you'd expect variations in technique, improvements in effects as the productions progressed, or occasional continuity errors where different missions showed the environment slightly differently. None of this appears. The moon looks like the moon in every image from every mission because it was the moon. Some specific photographic anomalies that conspiracy theorists cite actually provide evidence against a hoax when examined closely. The crosshairs in some images appear to go behind objects. Conspiracy theorists claim this proves the photos were manipulated, but photography experts explain it differently. The crosshairs were etched on a glass plate in the camera, creating reference marks on every photo. When very bright objects in the photo overexposed the film, the white areas bled slightly, obscuring the thin, dark crosshair lines. This is a well-understood photographic effect, not evidence of photo manipulation. If NASA were carefully faking photos, they wouldn't make such obvious mistakes that amateur conspiracy theorists could spot. They'd make perfect photos with no anomalies at all. The flag appearing to wave is another supposed anomaly, with a simple explanation. The flag had a horizontal rod along the top to keep it extended, since there's no wind on the moon to make a flag fly. When astronauts planted the flagpole, they had to twist it back and forth to get it into the hard lunar soil. This twisting motion caused the flag to wave on its horizontal rod. Once they stopped moving the pole, the flag stopped moving and remained still. Later footage from different missions shows flags hanging completely motionless, exactly as you'd expect in vacuum. The initial waving was simply momentum from the planting process, not wind. The absence of stars in lunar photographs is perhaps the most commonly cited anomaly, yet it has the simplest explanation. Cameras have to choose between exposing for bright subjects or dim subjects. On the moon, the surface and the astronauts' white spacesuits are brilliantly lit by the sun. To capture detail in these bright subjects without overexposing the image, the cameras used fast shutter speeds and small apertures. Stars are extremely dim compared to the sunlit surface. To photograph stars, you'd need a long exposure, many seconds or even minutes. But with a long exposure, the bright lunar surface would be completely washed out, just a white blob. The cameras were set to photograph the astronauts and the surface, not the stars. This is basic photography. If you've ever tried to photograph a brightly lit subject at night, you know that your camera can show either the subject or the stars in the background, but usually not both. Interestingly, some Apollo photographs do show stars. Images taken from the lunar orbit, where the spacecraft was in shadow and the cameras could use longer exposures, show stars beautifully. Images taken from the surface during lunar night portions of later missions also show stars. The stars appear when the photographic conditions allow, and they don't when the conditions don't. This is exactly what real photography would produce, and it's more complex than a hoaxer in 1969 would likely think to fake. The film technology itself provides evidence against a hoax. The Apollo missions used film stock that had to survive extreme conditions. Temperature swings from boiling hot to freezing cold. Vacuum that could cause ordinary materials to outgas. Radiation that could fog regular film. NASA tested various films and chose special stock that could handle these conditions. The photographic companies that produced this film knew what it was for and where it was going. The engineers who designed the camera modifications knew what conditions the equipment would face. If the missions were faked, why go to such trouble? Why develop special film and cameras for conditions you're not actually going to encounter? There's also the matter of the total amount of footage and photography. The 6 Apollo landing missions produced about 170 hours of video, more than 8,000 photographs, continuous audio recordings of all communications, and detailed telemetry data tracking every system on the spacecraft. Creating this much material, all consistent, all coherent, all technically accurate, would be an enormous undertaking. You'd need writers to script the dialogue. Except the dialogue is natural, spontaneous, full of the kind of casual remarks and technical jargon that professional astronauts and engineers would actually use. You'd need actors who could convincingly portray astronauts under stress, problem-solving in real time, adapting to unexpected situations. You'd need to stage accidents and equipment malfunctions that look genuine. You'd need to produce all of this in a way that would fool not just the general public but expert engineers, scientists, and astronauts themselves. Speaking of those experts, consider the astronauts. 12 men walked on the moon over 6 missions. All of them spent the rest of their lives describing their experiences, giving interviews, writing books, speaking at conferences. Their descriptions are consistent with each other and with the photographic and video evidence. They describe specific sensations, the way dust felt through their gloves, the way the horizon looked oddly close because the moon is smaller than Earth, the way they had to learn to walk in reduced gravity, the way their spacesuits were stiff and made movement difficult, the way looking back at Earth, hanging in the black sky, filled them with awe. These aren't rehearsed lines. These are the recollections of people who experienced something profound and struggled to put it into words. Are we to believe that 12 men, all trained pilots and engineers, committed to a lifetime of lies? That not one of them, in over 50 years, ever confessed or made a mistake that revealed the hoax? Consider Apollo 13, the mission that didn't land on the moon, but is famous for the dramatic rescue after an oxygen tank exploded. The mission was broadcast live. People watched as the crisis unfolded in real time. Mission Control worked frantically to solve problems, to figure out how to get the astronauts home safely, using only the resources available on the crippled spacecraft. Engineers built makeshift carbon dioxide scrubbers based on instructions radioed to the astronauts. The whole world watched, held its breath, and celebrated when the crew splashed down safely. If Apollo missions were faked, if the spacecraft never left Earth orbit, then the Apollo 13 crisis was staged. Mission controllers would have been actors. Engineers building equipment to test procedures would have been part of the deception. The tension, the fear, the relief, all fabricated. This seems far less plausible than the simple explanation. The crisis was real because the mission was real. There's a concept in logic called Occam's razor, which suggests that the simplest explanation requiring the fewest assumptions is usually correct. When we compare the two narratives, faking the moon landings requires an extraordinary number of assumptions. You must assume that NASA, the US government, thousands of contractors, hundreds of thousands of employees, all collaborated on a massive deception. You must assume they developed film and special effects technology decades ahead of its time, secretly, without anyone in Hollywood noticing. You must assume that every foreign government that tracked the missions was either fooled or complicit. You must assume that every scientist who studied moon rocks for the past 50 years either didn't notice they were fake or agreed to stay silent. You must assume that astronauts maintained perfect consistency in their lies for their entire lives. You must assume that not one person out of the hundreds of thousands involved ever had a crisis of conscience, never made a mistake, never left evidence of the fraud. Compare this to the alternative narrative. NASA did what it said it did. The Apollo program, backed by enormous funding, brilliant minds, and incredible determination, succeeded in landing humans on the moon. This explanation requires far fewer assumptions. It's consistent with the evidence. It fits with what we know about history, about the Cold War space race, about the capabilities of 60s technology to build rockets, if not to fake elaborate hoaxes. The question of whether it would have been possible to fake the footage brings up an interesting point raised by some film experts. In some ways, the Apollo footage is too good to be fake, but in other ways, it's not quite good enough to be fake. Let me explain. The footage is too good in the sense that it shows things that would have been nearly impossible to fake convincingly in 1969. The dust physics, the lighting, the movement in low gravity, the sheer consistency across multiple missions. But it's not good enough in the sense that a professional filmmaker faking it would have made it look better. There would be dramatic camera angles, perfect framing, professional lighting design. Instead, the footage often has amateur qualities. The camera work is functional, but not artistic. Frames are sometimes awkwardly composed. Occasionally, the camera is pointed at the wrong thing at the wrong time, missing important moments. This is what you'd expect from astronauts, who had cameras mounted on their chests and were focused on completing their mission objectives, not on producing cinematically compelling footage. If Stanley Kubrick or another skilled filmmaker had been involved, as some conspiracy theorists claim, the footage would look more polished. It would have better composition, more dynamic shots, more attention to visual storytelling. The fact that it doesn't, that it looks like documentary footage shot by busy people with other priorities, actually supports its authenticity. Real documentary footage from real events often has these qualities. It's informative and valuable despite not being cinematically perfect. Fake footage created by professionals trying to deceive would be more carefully crafted. There's one more aspect of the technical impossibility argument that's worth considering. Modern visual effects experts have tried to recreate Apollo footage using contemporary technology. Even with computers, sophisticated software, and decades of advancement in effects work, they find it challenging. They can approximate the look, but achieving perfection is difficult. Details like the dust physics require complex particle simulations. The lighting needs careful setup. Movement in low gravity requires motion capture and digital alteration. If modern experts with tools that would seem miraculous in 1969 struggle to perfectly replicate Apollo footage, how could anyone have faked it convincingly at the time? The conclusion from technical analysis is clear. Creating fake Apollo footage and photography that would survive scrutiny for over 50 years would have required capabilities far beyond what existed in 1969. It would have been more expensive, more technologically demanding, and more difficult than actually going to the moon. This might seem paradoxical, but it's true. Building rockets and spacecraft was hard, but the engineering challenges could be solved with enough time, money, and effort. Creating fake footage that would fool experts in multiple fields, that would remain convincing as technology advanced and allowed for more detailed analysis, that would be consistent across multiple missions, that would match the evidence provided by physical samples and instruments left on the moon, that would satisfy scrutiny by adversaries with sophisticated tracking capabilities. All of this would have required magic, not technology. When we combine this technical analysis with everything else, the case becomes overwhelming. We have physical evidence in the form of moon rocks that have been verified by scientists worldwide. We have instruments on the lunar surface that we still use. We have photographs from multiple independent orbiters showing the landing sites. We have the silence of America's Cold War adversary, who would have loved to expose a fraud. We have radio tracking data from multiple countries confirming the spacecraft went to the moon. We have consistent testimony from thousands of participants. We have footage and photography that could not have been faked with 60s technology. All of these independent lines of evidence point to the same conclusion. The moon landings were real. 12 Americans walked on another world between 1969 and 1972. They collected hundreds of pounds of samples. They deployed scientific instruments. They took thousands of photographs. They left behind equipment that we can still see from orbit. They left footprints that will persist for millions of years. They expanded human knowledge, pushed technological boundaries, and demonstrated what our species can achieve when we commit to ambitious goals. This achievement stands as one of the most remarkable in human history, not because of conspiracy theories that try to tear it down, but because it actually happened. Now, we've covered 6 major categories of evidence: physical samples, functioning instruments, orbital photography, geopolitical considerations, independent tracking, and technical feasibility. Each category alone provides strong support for the reality of the moon landings. Together, they create an interlocking web of evidence that makes denial irrational. But we're not done. In the next part of our investigation, we'll examine additional dimensions of this story. We'll look at the sheer number of people who would have needed to maintain the secret. We'll explore the scientific legacy that Apollo created and ask whether a hoax could have generated the same scientific advances. We'll examine modern verification techniques that continue to confirm the landings. And we'll consider what the persistence of moon landing denial tells us about our modern world and our relationship with evidence and truth. But for now, let's take stock of where we are. We started with a question: were the Americans on the moon? We've examined rocks that could only have come from another world. We've discussed laser beams bouncing off retroreflectors placed by astronauts. We've looked at photographs from space showing footprints and equipment. We've considered why the Soviet Union stayed silent. We've analyzed whether faking it all would even have been possible. At each step, the evidence has pointed in the same direction. Not because of faith, or because we trust authority, but because multiple independent, verifiable, physical lines of evidence all converge on the same conclusion. The moon landings happened. Humans walked on another world. It wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. It cost enormous amounts of money, required the efforts of hundreds of thousands of people, pushed technology to its limits, and claimed the lives of astronauts who died in the attempt. But it happened. And the evidence is there for anyone willing to look at it honestly. In the continuing story, we'll deepen our understanding of why this achievement matters, and why the conspiracy theories that try to deny it reveal more about us, about our modern culture, than they do about history. Before we move on to examine even more evidence in the next part, remember this: questioning is healthy. Skepticism is valuable. Demanding evidence is good practice. But when the evidence arrives, when multiple independent sources confirm a claim, when experts in relevant fields reach consensus, when physical objects support the narrative, continuing to deny becomes something else entirely. It becomes willful blindness, refusing to accept reality because the truth doesn't fit our preferred story. The moon landings inspire doubt in some people because they seem too incredible. But incredible achievements are what make human progress possible. Sometimes, the most unbelievable stories are true because humans are capable of unbelievable things when we work together toward a common goal. The story of Apollo is one such achievement, real and verified, standing as testament to human ingenuity, courage, and determination. Let's continue our journey through one of history's most debated questions. We've examined physical evidence, looked at instruments still functioning on the lunar surface, and analyzed photographs from space. Now, we need to dig deeper into aspects that many conspiracy theorists overlook, aspects that make the idea of a hoax not just unlikely, but essentially impossible when you really think through the implications. One argument that deserves serious attention is what we might call the human factor. The Apollo program wasn't a small operation run by a handful of people in a secret bunker. It was a massive national effort that employed roughly 400,000 people across the United States. Think about that number for a moment. 400,000. That's roughly the population of a decent-sized city. That's more people than work for most major corporations today. All of these people were involved in some aspect of the Apollo program, from engineers designing rocket components, to technicians assembling spacecraft, to scientists analyzing data, to administrative staff managing budgets and schedules. Now, if the moon landings were faked, how many of these 400,000 people would have needed to know about the deception? You might think only a small core group would need to be in on it, with everyone else genuinely believing they were working on real lunar missions. But when you examine how the program actually operated, this idea falls apart quickly. Let's walk through why. Start with the astronauts themselves. 12 men supposedly walked on the moon. If the missions were faked, these 12 men would absolutely need to know. They couldn't be fooled about whether they actually went to the moon or not. So that's 12 people who would need to maintain a lie for the rest of their lives. But it doesn't stop there. What about the other astronauts who flew to the moon but stayed in orbit? The command module pilots like Michael Collins, who remained in lunar orbit while Armstrong and Aldrin were supposedly on the surface. They'd need to know too. And what about all the backup crews? The astronauts who trained for missions but didn't fly? They trained alongside the prime crews, knew the procedures intimately, understood what a real mission would entail versus a fake one. They'd need to be complicit, or at least suspicious. That brings us to maybe 2 or 3 dozen astronauts who would need to either know about the hoax or be remarkably incurious about inconsistencies. But astronauts don't work in isolation. They work closely with mission control. During the Apollo 11 moonwalk, hundreds of people were in the mission control room or supporting facilities, monitoring every system, tracking the spacecraft, managing communications. These weren't actors reading scripts. These were trained engineers and technicians who understood the systems they were monitoring. If the telemetry data they were seeing didn't match a spacecraft actually on the moon, they would have known. If the radio transmissions weren't really coming from lunar distance, they would have detected it. So now we're talking about hundreds more people who would need to be part of the conspiracy. Then consider the tracking stations. The Apollo missions were tracked by facilities around the world. The Madrid Deep Space Communication Complex in Spain, the Canberra Deep Space Communication Complex in Australia, The Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex in California. These stations used massive dish antennas to receive signals from the spacecraft. The operators at these facilities weren't just passive receivers. They were actively tracking the spacecraft position, measuring signal strength, calculating trajectories based on Doppler shift. If the spacecraft weren't actually where NASA claimed, these tracking stations would have detected the discrepancy. The operators and engineers at these facilities would need to be in on the conspiracy too, or incredibly incompetent at their jobs. The spacecraft themselves were built by contractors across the country. North American Aviation built the Command and Service Module. Grumman Aircraft built the Lunar Module. Boeing built the first stage of the Saturn V rocket. Thousands of workers at these companies manufactured components, assembled spacecraft, tested systems. If the spacecraft were never actually intended to go to the moon, if they were just props for a deception, someone in the manufacturing process would have noticed. Engineers checking specifications would have seen that components weren't built to survive translunar flight. Technicians conducting tests would have discovered that systems didn't function as they should. Quality control inspectors would have found inconsistencies. All of these people would need to either be fooled by remarkably sophisticated fake specifications and procedures, or be complicit in the deception. Think about the rocket fuel. The Saturn V required millions of pounds of liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, and kerosene. This fuel was manufactured, transported, and loaded into the rocket in full view of thousands of people. If the rocket wasn't actually going to the moon, if it was just going to launch and then dump the spacecraft somewhere for a fake mission, you'd need far less fuel. The weight calculations would be completely different. The engineers designing fuel loading procedures would notice. The suppliers providing the fuel would see discrepancies between what was ordered and what would actually be needed for a fake mission. Or consider the heat shield on the command module. When spacecraft returned from the moon, they hit Earth's atmosphere at about 25,000 miles per hour, much faster than spacecraft returning from low Earth orbit. This extreme speed generates tremendous heat. The Apollo command module had an ablative heat shield designed to burn away gradually, carrying heat away from the crew compartment. This heat shield was engineered specifically for the high-speed re-entry from lunar missions. If Apollo spacecraft never went to the moon, they wouldn't need such an elaborate heat shield. The engineers who designed it would know this. The technicians who installed it would know this. The inspectors who verified it would know this. The same logic applies to countless other components. The navigation system designed to guide spacecraft across 250,000 miles of space. The life support systems designed to keep astronauts alive for over a week in a cramped spacecraft. The communication systems designed to transmit signals across lunar distances. The cameras and film designed to function in the extreme lunar environment. Each of these systems was designed by teams of engineers who understood what requirements a real lunar mission would impose. If the mission were fake, many of these elaborate systems would be unnecessary, and the engineers would notice. Then there's the scientific equipment. The Apollo missions deployed numerous experiments on the lunar surface: seismometers to detect moonquakes, solar wind collectors, laser retroreflectors, magnetometers. Each of these instruments was designed by scientists for specific research purposes. The scientists designing these experiments would know whether the data coming back could be genuine or fabricated. They'd know what real lunar conditions should produce versus what a fake setup in a studio would produce. Are we to believe that all these scientists were fooled, or that they're all complicit in the deception? The samples brought back from the moon required an entire facility to handle and study them. The Lunar Receiving Laboratory, and later the Lunar Sample Laboratory, employed dozens of people whose job was to catalog, store, and prepare samples for scientific study. These curators handled the rocks, examined them, divided them for distribution to researchers. If the rocks were fake, manufactured in a laboratory or collected from Antarctica or somewhere else on Earth, the curators would be among the first to know. They'd see inconsistencies in the samples. They'd notice features that didn't match genuine lunar material. All of these curators would need to be part of the conspiracy. The researchers who studied the samples present an even bigger problem for the hoax theory. Over the past 50 years, thousands of scientists from hundreds of institutions in dozens of countries have studied Apollo samples. These researchers published their findings in peer-reviewed journals. They presented results at international conferences. They built their careers on lunar science. If the samples were fake, some of these scientists would have discovered it. You can't fool thousands of experts for 50 years. Someone would have noticed anomalies, published contradictory findings, raised alarms. The fact that this hasn't happened, that international scientific consensus supports the authenticity of the samples, means either all these scientists are complicit or the samples are genuine. We also need to consider the families of all these people. 400,000 employees means probably over 1 million people when you include spouses, children, close friends. If someone were part of a massive conspiracy to fake the moon landings, they might tell their spouse. They might confide in a close friend. They might make a deathbed confession. The secret would spread beyond the direct participants. Yet in over 50 years, not one credible whistleblower has come forward with insider evidence of a hoax. Not one person has produced documentation, correspondence, or recording proving the landings were faked. Not one person has given a deathbed confession that has withstood scrutiny. Some conspiracy theorists suggest that people were kept in compartmentalized roles, where each person only knew their small piece of the puzzle and didn't see the big picture. This is how intelligence operations sometimes work. But the Apollo program wasn't structured this way. It was a highly integrated effort, where different teams needed to coordinate closely. Engineers designing the lunar module needed detailed specifications about the command module to ensure the two spacecraft could dock successfully. Mission planners needed to understand spacecraft capabilities, astronaut procedures, and scientific objectives. Ground controllers needed comprehensive knowledge of spacecraft systems. The program required constant communication and collaboration across thousands of individuals and organizations. You couldn't compartmentalize it effectively enough to hide a fundamental deception about whether the missions were real. There's also the question of motivation. Why would hundreds of thousands of people participate in or turn a blind eye to a massive fraud? The standard answer from conspiracy theorists is that people were patriotic, afraid of losing their jobs, or simply following orders. But this doesn't hold up under examination. Many of the people involved were scientists and engineers who valued truth and accuracy. Their professional reputations depended on producing good work. Faking scientific results would go against everything they were trained to believe in. And many of them went on to have long careers after Apollo, careers built on credibility and expertise. Maintaining a lie for decades would put all of that at risk. Moreover, not everyone involved was American. As we've discussed, tracking stations in other countries monitored the missions. Scientists in other countries studied the samples. Contractors in some cases were international. All of these non-American participants would have no particular loyalty to the United States, no compelling reason to protect an American hoax. Yet, none of them have exposed a fraud. Let's consider a specific example that illustrates the human factor problem. During the Apollo 13 crisis, engineers at Mission Control had to figure out how to jury-rig a carbon dioxide scrubber using only materials available on the spacecraft. They gathered representatives from different contractors who built different components. They dumped out a box containing duplicates of everything the astronauts had access to. They had to invent a solution using oddly shaped parts that weren't designed to fit together. This scene was dramatized in the movie Apollo 13, but it was based on real events that were documented contemporaneously. If the Apollo missions were fake, this crisis was staged. The engineers working on the problem were actors, or were solving a fake problem for a fake crisis. But these weren't professional actors. These were real engineers with real expertise who continued working at NASA for years afterward. Some of them gave interviews decades later describing that day, the pressure they felt, the satisfaction when their improvised solution worked. Are we to believe they've maintained this elaborate fiction for their entire careers? That they gather at reunions and reminisce about an event that never happened while staying perfectly consistent in their false memories? The human factor extends beyond NASA and its contractors. Journalists covered the Apollo program extensively. Reporters embedded with NASA, interviewed astronauts, attended launches, asked difficult questions. Some of these journalists were skeptical, looking for scandal or deception. If there had been obvious signs of a hoax, investigative reporters would have pursued the story aggressively. The media in the 60s and 70s wasn't uniformly friendly to the government. Watergate happened during this period, proving that journalists could expose government lies. Yet, despite extensive media coverage, no journalist uncovered evidence of faked moon landings. There were also political opponents who would have loved to undermine the Apollo program. Not everyone in Congress supported the massive spending. Some politicians questioned whether the money could be better spent on domestic programs. If there had been evidence of fraud, political opponents would have seized on it. Congressional hearings would have been convened. Whistleblowers would have been encouraged to come forward. None of this happened. And let's talk about later space missions. After Apollo, the United States continued its space program with Skylab, the Space Shuttle, and eventually the International Space Station. These programs involved many of the same people who worked on Apollo, as well as new generations who learned from Apollo veterans. If Apollo had been faked, this knowledge would have been passed down, at least as rumors or suspicions. New employees would have heard stories, noticed inconsistencies, questioned official narratives. Yet the space program continued with institutional knowledge, treating Apollo as real, building on lessons learned from those missions. The International Space Station is particularly interesting because it involves multiple countries. American astronauts work alongside Russian cosmonauts, European astronauts, Japanese astronauts, Canadian astronauts. They train together, live together in space, share knowledge and expertise. If American space capability were built on a foundation of fraud, Russian cosmonauts who remember the Soviet space program would surely notice inconsistencies. They'd see gaps in American knowledge or technique that would suggest Apollo experiences were fabricated. Instead, they've worked seamlessly with American colleagues, accepting Apollo as part of the shared history of human spaceflight. We should also consider the physical artifacts that remain. Various museums display Apollo hardware. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum has command modules, spacesuits, rocks, equipment. These aren't replicas or models. These are actual artifacts that can be examined, measured, analyzed. Materials scientists can study the heat damage on command module heat shields. They can examine the wear patterns on spacesuit gloves. They can analyze the lunar dust that clings to returned equipment. All of this physical evidence is consistent with having been to the moon. If it were all faked, it would require manufacturing artifacts that would fool expert examination decades later, using materials and techniques that didn't exist in the 60s. The documentation is equally impressive. NASA's archive contains millions of pages of documents related to Apollo. Mission plans, engineering specifications, test reports, communications transcripts, flight data, photographs, film, everything. This documentation is available to researchers. Historians have written detailed accounts of the program based on this archival material. If the program were a hoax, this documentation would need to be consistently faked across millions of pages, covering technical details that would need to remain coherent when examined by experts in various fields. The scope of such a documentary fraud would be staggering. Consider also the technology transfer that came from Apollo. The program drove innovation in numerous fields: computer technology, materials science, telecommunications, life support systems, all advanced because of challenges the Apollo program needed to solve. Companies that worked on Apollo used technologies developed for the program in their commercial products. If the program were fake, this technology transfer wouldn't have occurred, or it would have needed to be fabricated separately, which raises the question of why you'd fake both a moon program and the technical innovations that should have come from it. When we think about the human factor comprehensively, we're not just talking about the difficulty of keeping a secret. We're talking about the impossibility of maintaining a coherent, false reality across hundreds of thousands of people, multiple countries, diverse institutions, generations of scientists and engineers, extensive documentation, physical artifacts, and ongoing technological legacy. Each person who would need to be complicit or fooled represents a potential weak point where the conspiracy could unravel. With 400,000 people involved over 50 years, the mathematical probability of maintaining perfect secrecy approaches zero. There's actually a formula that researchers have developed to estimate how long conspiracies can remain secret based on the number of people involved. It's called the conspiracy equation, and it suggests that conspiracies with thousands of conspirators would be exposed within years, not decades. The Apollo hoax, if it existed, would involve hundreds of thousands of conspirators maintaining secrecy for over half a century. According to these mathematical models, this is essentially impossible. The conspiracy would have been exposed by the mid-70s at the latest. This brings us to a related point about the scientific legacy of Apollo, another dimension that conspiracy theories struggle to explain. The moon landings weren't just about planting flags and taking pictures. They were scientific missions that generated enormous amounts of data and drove advances across multiple fields. If the missions were faked, we need to ask, where did all the science come from? Let's start with lunar geology. Before Apollo, scientists had theories about the moon's formation and history based on telescopic observations. Apollo samples allowed these theories to be tested and refined. We learned that the moon is about 4.5 billion years old, roughly the same age as Earth. We confirmed that the dark maria on the moon's surface are ancient lava flows from a period when the moon was geologically active. We discovered that the moon's crust is rich in a mineral called anorthosite, suggesting that early in the moon's history, it had a magma ocean that slowly crystallized. We found evidence of ancient meteorite bombardment that shaped the lunar surface. These weren't just interesting facts. They changed our understanding of planetary formation. The moon became a Rosetta Stone for understanding how rocky planets develop. Scientists studying Mars, Mercury, Venus, and even Earth used insights from lunar geology to interpret features on these other worlds. If the moon rocks were fake, if the data were fabricated, how did this fake data lead to genuine insights that proved applicable to real planetary science? How did fabricated samples produce results that matched what later missions to other bodies would confirm about general planetary processes? Take the giant impact hypothesis for the moon's formation. This theory suggests the moon formed from debris after a Mars-sized object collided with early Earth. This hypothesis gained support from Apollo samples, which showed the moon is depleted in volatile elements and has similar isotopic signatures to Earth in some respects, while differing in others. The chemistry of the rocks told a story about a violent formation process involving extreme heat. Later, computer simulations of such a collision produced predictions about the resulting body that matched the moon's actual properties. If the Apollo samples were fake, it would be an extraordinary coincidence that their fabricated chemistry happened to support a theory that computer models would later validate through completely independent means. Or consider our understanding of the early solar system. Apollo samples contained information about the intense meteorite bombardment that occurred about 4 billion years ago, an event called the Late Heavy Bombardment. This bombardment affected not just the moon, but all the inner planets. Evidence for it shows up in lunar craters and in the ages of lunar rocks. Later missions to Mars and studies of Martian meteorites found evidence of similar ancient bombardment. If Apollo samples were fabricated, someone in the 60s would have needed to invent the concept of late, heavy bombardment, fake evidence of it in the samples, and then wait for decades until other evidence from Mars confirmed it. That's remarkably prescient fabrication. Apollo also transformed our understanding of space weathering, the process by which surfaces in space are altered by micrometeorite impacts, solar wind, and cosmic rays. Lunar samples showed features like tiny impact craters on individual grains, amorphous rims on particles created by micrometeorite melting, and implanted solar wind gases. These features were unexpected and required scientists to develop new theories about how surfaces evolve in the space environment. Later, when we started collecting samples from asteroids, we saw similar space weathering features, confirming that the processes identified from lunar samples are general phenomena. Again, if lunar samples were fake, the fabricators would have needed to invent realistic space weathering features that would later turn out to match what we find on asteroids collected decades afterward. The Apollo program also drove advances in fields beyond planetary science. The challenges of sending humans to the moon required solving problems in life support, navigation, telecommunications, materials science, and computer engineering. Many of these solutions had applications beyond spaceflight. For instance, the fuel cells developed for Apollo became the basis for fuel cell technology explored for terrestrial applications. The miniaturization of electronics required for spacecraft computers contributed to the broader trend towards smaller, more powerful electronics. The materials developed to withstand extreme space conditions found uses in other industries. If the moon program were fake, would NASA have bothered to actually solve all these technical problems? Why develop a functioning life support system if astronauts aren't actually going to the moon? Why create genuine advances in computer engineering if the computers are just props? You could argue that NASA did the engineering work anyway to make the hoax convincing, but that defeats the purpose of faking it. If you're going to do all the hard engineering work, you might as well actually go to the moon. There's also the matter of scientific predictions verified later. Apollo missions deployed seismometers that detected moonquakes. Data from these seismometers allowed scientists to create models of the moon's interior structure. They determined that the moon probably has a small core, a thick mantle, and a relatively thick crust. This internal structure explained various properties of the moon that had been puzzling. Decades later, when newer lunar orbiters carried instruments to study the moon's gravitational field and heat flow, the data confirmed the interior structure models based on Apollo seismometer data. If the Apollo seismometer data were faked, the fabricators would have needed to invent data that would remain consistent with discoveries made by completely different instruments decades later. Let's think about the retroreflectors again, but from a scientific legacy perspective, rather than just as evidence of presence. The laser ranging experiments using these retroreflectors have provided precise measurements of the Earth-Moon distance over decades. These measurements have revealed that the Moon is receding from Earth at about 1.5 inches per year. This measurement confirmed predictions from tidal theory and improved our understanding of tidal interactions in celestial mechanics. Scientists have used this data to refine estimates of how tidal forces affect planetary systems. If the retroreflectors were placed by robots instead of astronauts, this doesn't change the scientific value of the data, but it does raise questions about why conspiracy theorists claim the moon landings produced no useful science when clearly they did. The photographic legacy is another aspect worth considering. Apollo astronauts took thousands of photographs of the lunar surface from various altitudes and angles. These photographs became the basis for detailed maps of the moon that scientists used for decades. When later missions like Clementine and Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter produced new high-resolution maps, they matched the Apollo photographs. Features that appeared in the background of an astronaut photo taken from the surface could be identified in orbital imagery. Shadows on mountains visible in Apollo photos fell in directions consistent with the sun angle at the time and location the photos were supposedly taken. This consistency, across thousands of images from 6 different sites over 3 years, would be extraordinarily difficult to fake, especially since the photos needed to remain consistent with discoveries made by missions decades later. Apollo also left behind a record in the form of the landing sites themselves. Future missions, whether crewed or robotic, can return to these sites and see exactly what the Apollo astronauts saw. The tracks will still be there. The equipment will be in the same positions. The samples collected can be compared to samples collected from nearby locations. This creates a permanent record that can be verified repeatedly. If the landings were faked, every future mission that visits these sites would expose the fraud. The fact that we keep planning future lunar missions without apparent concern about what they might find at the old Apollo sites suggests confidence that there's nothing to hide. The educational legacy is also significant. Apollo inspired a generation to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Many prominent scientists and engineers cite Apollo as the reason they chose their careers. This inspiration was real, regardless of whether the landings were real, but the sustained impact suggests something genuine. If it came out that the whole thing was fake, it would devastate not just those individuals, but the broader public trust in science that Apollo helped build. You'd think at least some of the scientists who claim Apollo inspired them would question their assumptions, investigate the truth, and if they found evidence of a hoax, expose it. Instead, these scientists have spent their careers building on Apollo's legacy, treating it as a genuine achievement that opened new frontiers. We should also consider the ongoing research using Apollo samples and data. Even now, more than 50 years later, scientists continue to study Apollo samples with new techniques that didn't exist when the samples were first brought back. As analytical technology improves, researchers can extract more information from the same rocks. They can measure isotopic ratios with greater precision. They can identify minerals that were too small to see with older microscopes. They can detect trace elements that earlier instruments couldn't measure. Each new generation of analysis confirms and expands on earlier findings. If the samples were fake, you'd expect that improved analytical techniques would eventually expose inconsistencies or impossibilities. Instead, the samples become more interesting and informative with better analysis. There's a particular joy in science when predictions are confirmed by independent observations. Apollo science is full of these moments. A scientist studying Apollo samples predicts something about the moon based on chemical analysis. Years later, an orbital mission or a ground-based telescope observation confirms the prediction. These confirmations happen repeatedly because the Apollo data is genuine, reflecting real lunar properties. If the data were fabricated, lucky guesses would occasionally happen, but you wouldn't see the consistent pattern of predictions and confirmations that characterizes Apollo science. Let's talk about modern verification methods, techniques that didn't exist during the Apollo era, but can be applied now to verify claims about the missions. We've already discussed LRO photographs of the landing sites, but there are other modern approaches that confirm the landings. For instance, we can now analyze Apollo video footage with computer algorithms that detect inconsistencies or manipulations. Modern video forensics can identify when footage has been edited, when different takes have been spliced together, when backgrounds have been artificially inserted. Researchers have analyzed Apollo footage using these techniques and found no evidence of manipulation. The footage appears to be continuous recordings of actual events, not carefully constructed forgeries. The same is true for photographs. Digital analysis of Apollo photographs reveals no signs of manipulation with the techniques that would have been available in the 60s. No evidence of matte paintings or composite images. No signs of airbrushing or retouching to hide studio equipment. The photos appear to be genuine photographs of real scenes. More than that, the photos show consistent lighting, correct perspective, and accurate scale in ways that would be nearly impossible to fake before digital editing tools existed. We can also analyze the physical properties of Apollo artifacts using modern, non-destructive techniques. Returned spacecraft have been studied with sophisticated instruments that can identify materials, measure wear patterns, and detect contamination. These analyses show evidence consistent with having been in space. The command modules show heat damage patterns consistent with high-speed atmospheric re-entry. Space-exposed surfaces show micrometeorite impact damage. Materials show degradation consistent with exposure to vacuum, radiation, and extreme temperature variations. All of this physical evidence matches what we'd expect from spacecraft that actually went to the moon, and it would be extremely difficult to fake convincingly. The advancement in scientific understanding since Apollo also serves as verification. As we've learned more about the moon from later missions, every new discovery has been consistent with what Apollo taught us. None of the later missions have found evidence contradicting Apollo results. Clementine mapped the moon's composition from orbit and found distributions of minerals consistent with Apollo sample analyses. Lunar Prospector detected water ice in polar craters and hydrogen in the regolith, findings that fit with Apollo's discovery of solar wind implanted in lunar soil. The L-Cross mission intentionally crashed into a crater and analyzed the resulting plume, finding water and other volatiles in amounts consistent with theories developed from Apollo data. Each of these later missions could have contradicted Apollo if the earlier data were false. None have. Modern telescopes can also contribute to verification. Astronomers have photographed the larger pieces of Apollo hardware left in lunar orbit or crashed onto the surface. The SIVB upper stages of Saturn rockets were deliberately crashed into the moon to create seismic signals for the seismometers to detect. The impact locations were recorded, and modern telescopes have imaged some of these impact sites. The craters are where they should be, with sizes consistent with the impacts that created them. This corroborates the mission records. We can even look at the moon's surface with powerful Earth-based telescopes and verify details of Apollo photographs. A photograph showing a particular crater or mountain range can be compared to modern telescopic images of the same area. The features match. The perspectives are correct given the location and elevation of the Apollo astronauts. The lighting in the Apollo photo is consistent with the sun angle at that location and time. Thousands of photos can be cross-referenced this way, each one adding to the body of verification. There's also the matter of how the conspiracy theory landscape has evolved. When hoax theories first emerged in the 70s, they made specific claims about impossibilities or anomalies. As these claims were debunked, the theories evolved, making new claims or shifting focus to different supposed evidence. This evolution shows that the original claims didn't hold up to scrutiny. If there were genuine evidence of a hoax, the same evidence would remain convincing over time. Instead, conspiracy theorists have had to continually reinvent their arguments as each previous version was refuted. Modern technology has also enabled citizen science. Amateur astronomers can observe the moon with equipment that would have seemed professional grade a few decades ago. Radio amateurs can attempt to detect signals from satellites in lunar orbit. Computer enthusiasts can process raw image data released by space agencies. None of these amateur investigators have found evidence of fraud. Instead, they've generally confirmed official findings, adding independent verification to the professional work. The internet has made information more accessible than ever before. NASA's archives are online. Scientific papers about Apollo are available. Mission transcripts, photographs, video, engineering documents, all can be accessed by anyone interested. This transparency invites scrutiny. If there were smoking gun evidence of a hoax buried in the massive amount of available data, someone would have found it by now. The fact that no such evidence has emerged after decades of public access suggests it doesn't exist. We should also consider the legal and ethical environment that would have applied if the hoax had been discovered. Whistleblower protections have grown stronger over the decades. Journalists have more tools to protect sources. Scientists have ethical obligations to report fraud. If someone with inside knowledge of a moon landing hoax wanted to come forward, they'd have multiple safe avenues to do so. Yet, no credible whistleblower has emerged. Think about how other government deceptions have been exposed. Watergate was revealed by whistleblowers and investigative journalism. The Iran-Contra affair came to light through congressional investigations. CIA, secret prisons were exposed by journalists and leakers. Government lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were eventually revealed. These examples show that governments can't keep significant secrets forever, especially when many people are involved. The fact that no moon hoax has been exposed despite being far larger and involving far more people than these other scandals suggests there's no hoax to expose. Modern amateur scientists have also replicated some Apollo experiments. You can buy retroreflectors and try to detect them with a strong enough laser and telescope. Amateur groups have done this and successfully detected returns from the Apollo retroreflectors. You can attempt to receive signals from lunar orbiters. Radio amateurs have done this. You can observe the moon during a lunar eclipse and see thermal anomalies where Apollo landing sites are located, due to disturbed regolith having different thermal properties. Astronomy students have done this. All these independent amateur verifications add to the professional evidence. So when we look at modern verification, we see multiple independent methods, all confirming the same conclusion. Video forensics finds no evidence of manipulation. Physical analysis of artifacts shows evidence of space exposure. Later missions confirm Apollo findings. Telescopic observations match Apollo photographs. Amateur investigations corroborate official claims. Whistleblowers have never emerged despite decades of opportunity. The scientific legacy continues to generate accurate predictions. Technology that supposedly didn't exist in the 60s consistently performed as documented. Let's step back and consider what we've covered in this investigation. We started with physical samples that have been verified by thousands of scientists worldwide. We examined functioning instruments on the lunar surface that we still use for experiments. We looked at photographs from multiple independent lunar orbiters, showing the landing sites in detail. We considered the geopolitical situation and why the Soviet Union never exposed a hoax. We analyzed the technical feasibility of faking the footage and concluded it would have been harder than actually going. We examined the human factor and recognized that maintaining a conspiracy among hundreds of thousands of people for 50 years is essentially impossible. We explored the scientific legacy that emerged from Apollo and continues to generate accurate predictions. We looked at modern verification methods that consistently confirm the landings. Each of these lines of evidence independently supports the conclusion that humans walked on the moon. But the real power comes from how they reinforce each other. The moon rocks match predictions made by scientists studying orbital photographs. The retroreflectors are at locations where spacecraft descent stages are visible from orbit. The tracks in LRO images lead between equipment in patterns, matching mission transcripts. The Soviet silence makes sense when you know they independently verified the missions and collected their own samples that matched. The human factor explains why whistleblowers never emerged despite enormous conspiracies usually being exposed. The scientific legacy shows that real discoveries came from the missions. Modern verification confirms every aspect of the story. This isn't just a preponderance of evidence. This is an overwhelming convergence of independent verification from multiple disciplines, nations, and generations. It's the kind of evidence that in any other context would be considered absolute proof. If a criminal trial had this much physical evidence, witness testimony, expert analysis, and lack of contradictory evidence, the verdict would be unanimous and immediate. If a scientific hypothesis had this level of support from multiple independent experiments, it would be considered an established fact. So why do people still doubt? This question is perhaps more interesting psychologically than historically. Moon landing denial tells us more about human psychology, about trust in institutions, about the appeal of conspiracy thinking, than it tells us about what happened in the late 60s and early 70s. People are drawn to conspiracy theories for various reasons. Some feel powerless, and conspiracy theories give them a sense of having special knowledge that the masses don't possess. Some distrust authority because of legitimate grievances about government lies in other areas. Some find the complexity of the real world overwhelming and prefer simpler narratives where everything is controlled by shadowy forces. Some simply enjoy the intellectual puzzle of finding alternative explanations for accepted facts. Understanding these psychological motivations helps us see why evidence alone often doesn't convince conspiracy believers. They're not primarily motivated by evidence. They're motivated by the satisfaction of believing they've uncovered a hidden truth, by the community they find among fellow believers, by the identity they've built around skepticism. This doesn't make them stupid or crazy. It makes them human. We all have biases. We all prefer information that confirms what we already believe. We all sometimes resist changing our minds, even when evidence contradicts our positions. The difference is whether we can eventually overcome these biases when evidence becomes overwhelming. The persistence of moon landing denial also reflects genuine problems with institutional trust. Governments have lied. Scientists have sometimes been wrong. Corporate interests have corrupted research. These are real issues that deserve skepticism and scrutiny. The problem comes when healthy skepticism turns into reflexive denial of anything claimed by authorities, when every official statement is assumed to be false, regardless of supporting evidence. This kind of blanket denial makes it impossible to distinguish between genuine conspiracies and legitimate achievements. What's particularly ironic about moon landing denial is that it arose during a period when real government conspiracies were being exposed. Watergate, COINTELPRO, MKUltra, the Pentagon Papers, all these actual scandals came to light in the 70s, right when moon hoax theories were gaining traction. You might think these exposures would reduce conspiracy thinking by showing that real conspiracies do get uncovered, that whistleblowers come forward, that investigative journalism works. Instead, they seem to fuel a general suspicion that everything might be a conspiracy. People became so primed to expect deception that they started seeing it even where it didn't exist. The moon landings represent something that conspiracy thinking struggles to accommodate: genuine human achievement. Not everything is a conspiracy. Not every impressive accomplishment is fake. Sometimes, people really do work together, overcome obstacles, achieve difficult goals, and succeed in ways that seem impossible until they're done. The Apollo program was one of those times. It succeeded because brilliant people devoted themselves to solving hard problems, because a nation committed enormous resources to a single goal, because engineers and scientists and technicians and astronauts pushed beyond what they thought was possible. That's not a conspiracy. That's human potential realized through determination and ingenuity. There's a danger in conspiracy thinking that goes beyond just denying historical facts. It undermines our ability to accomplish great things in the future. If we teach young people that the moon landings were fake, we're teaching them that humanity's greatest achievements are lies. We're teaching them that ambition is pointless because successes are fabricated. We're teaching them to be cynical instead of inspired. The real legacy of Apollo isn't just the scientific discoveries or the technological advances. It's the demonstration that humans can do extraordinary things when we try, that problems that seem impossible can be solved, that the future doesn't have to be limited by what we've done before. Conspiracy theories threaten this legacy by replacing inspiration with suspicion, by turning achievement into fraud. So, as we conclude this investigation, let's be clear about what the evidence shows. 12 American astronauts walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. This happened. It's verified by physical evidence, scientific data, photographic documentation, independent observation, and the testimony of hundreds of thousands of people who worked to make it happen. The evidence for the moon landings is as strong as the evidence for any historical event. It's stronger than the evidence for most historical events, because we have so much physical material that can be examined and re-examined with ever-improving techniques. If we're going to doubt the moon landings, we'd have to doubt almost everything we think we know about history. But we don't have to doubt them. We can accept that sometimes humanity achieves great things. We can look at the evidence objectively and reach the obvious conclusion. We can teach our children about this achievement with pride, knowing it really happened, knowing that it demonstrates what's possible when people work together toward ambitious goals. We can use Apollo as inspiration for future challenges, whether that's returning to the moon, going to Mars, addressing climate change, curing diseases, or any other goal that seems too difficult until we accomplish it. The moon landings were real. The evidence is overwhelming. The accomplishment is genuine. And the legacy continues to inspire us more than 50 years later. That's the truth, supported by facts, verified by science, and confirmed by the very people who would have exposed a fraud if one existed. It's a truth worth celebrating, worth defending, and worth remembering as we face the challenges of our own time and work toward achievements that might seem impossible until we make them real. If you found this investigation compelling, if you appreciate the detailed examination of evidence, if you want to continue exploring questions about space, science, and the stories behind human achievement, then subscribe to Lazy Laboratory. We dive deep into fascinating topics, separate fact from fiction, and explore the incredible reality of our universe. Hit that like button if this video helped you understand the truth about the moon landings. Share it with anyone who's curious about this question. And let us know in the comments what space topic you'd like us to investigate next. The universe is full of real mysteries that don't require conspiracy theories to be fascinating. Let's explore them together. Until next time, keep looking up and keep questioning, but remember to follow where the evidence leads.